Hello, and welcome to the Sleepy Brainist. Tonight, we'll take a slow, peaceful journey into the quiet corners of the mind, where silence becomes medicine and stillness awakens the brain's deepest powers. As you settle in, take a moment to notice the silence around you. Maybe it's the soft hum of a fan, the distant sound of rain, or the deep quiet of midnight. Whatever surrounds you, let it all gently fade into the background. Before we begin, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Let us know in the comments. I love seeing how far this sleepy little community has reached. Now, close your eyes if you'd like. Breathe in slowly, and let's begin. Silence is often seen as the absence of something, a lack of noise, a space between sounds, a moment when nothing is happening. But in truth, silence is not empty. It's full of potential, full of healing, full of meaning. And for the human brain, silence is one of the most nourishing experiences it can have. Imagine a world without interruptions, no background hum of traffic, no buzzing notifications, no distant voices, no flickering screens, just stillness, just the soft rhythm of your own breath, the gentle beat of your heart, and the quiet presence of your own awareness. In this kind of silence, your brain is not bored, it's not idle, it's doing something extraordinary. Studies have shown that when we are surrounded by silence, even for just a few minutes, our brains begin to shift into a different mode. This is not the mode of focus or doing, but of being. The brain transitions from the active, task-oriented state, known as the executive network, into what scientists call the default mode network, a system that comes alive when we are not actively doing anything at all. It's in this space that we process our emotions, reflect on our memories, make sense of our experiences, and even begin to access deeper levels of creativity and insight. But why does silence trigger this transformation? Noise, especially the chronic kind we don't even notice anymore, like traffic, city life, or constant digital chatter, keeps our nervous system on alert. It raises cortisol, the stress hormone. It keeps the amygdala, the brain's fear center, slightly activated. Over time, this constant low-level stress becomes background noise within us, shaping our thoughts, moods, and behaviors without us even realizing it. Silence, on the other hand, has the opposite effect. When everything becomes quiet, the body begins to calm down. The heart rate slows. Blood pressure drops. The parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest part of our biology, begins to take over. The brain is no longer bracing itself for the next sound, the next demand, the next signal. Instead, it's given permission to breathe, to soften, to let go. In silence, the brain doesn't simply turn off. It becomes deeply active in subtle, restorative ways. It begins to clean itself, literally. The brain's glymphatic system, which flushes out metabolic waste from neural activity, becomes more efficient in restful states, especially when free from auditory stimulation. This means that silence isn't just mentally soothing, it's physically rejuvenating. It's like a deep, cleansing breath for your neurons. And perhaps most beautifully, silence reconnects us with things we've forgotten how to feel. In the stillness, we hear the whisper of our own intuition. We notice the small aches in our hearts, the quiet joys we often overlook, the gentle nudges towards self-awareness. It becomes a mirror, not one made of glass, but of space. In this mirror, the mind can look at itself without judgment or noise or distortion. Cultures throughout history have revered silence. Monks retreat into quiet not as punishment, but as a path to enlightenment. Poets describe it as sacred, scientists call it vital, and spiritual teachers say that in silence, the soul speaks. Whether through prayer, meditation, or simply stepping outside to watch the stars, moments of silence have always been associated with clarity, healing, and transformation. But today, silence is rare. We fill our lives with sound, music, podcasts, messages, shows, because we've become uncomfortable with empty space. We associate silence with loneliness, awkwardness, or even anxiety. But this discomfort is often a sign that silence is exactly what we need. Because the truth is, silence allows us to hear things that noise drowns out. It allows us to listen, not just to the world, but to ourselves. And in that listening, we remember who we are beneath the rush and the static. We remember what matters. We rediscover our inner rhythm, and in that rhythm, the brain begins to heal. So the next time you find yourself in a quiet room, instead of reaching for a device or filling the space with noise, try staying with it. Let the silence wrap around you like a soft blanket. Let it do its gentle work. Let your brain sink into that rare golden calm. Because silence, my friend, is not empty. It's the sound of your mind coming home. Deep inside your brain, there is a system that quietly awakens when you stop trying. When you pause your to-do lists, stop solving problems, and stop focusing on the outside world, this system comes to life. Scientists call it the default mode network, or DMN. It's a gentle, inward-focused state that thrives in stillness, in rest, and most especially in silence. You might think your brain only works when you're doing something, reading, writing, talking, making decisions. But some of its most important work happens when you do nothing at all. This quiet system of the brain, the DMN, lights up when you relax, when you daydream, when your thoughts begin to drift without direction. It's the part of your brain that engages when you go for a slow walk with no destination, when you stare out a window lost in thought, when you lie in bed, eyes closed, not yet asleep, but far from awake. In other words, the default mode network is your brain's natural rhythm when it's free from demands. Silence, pure and uninterrupted, is one of the most powerful triggers for this network to activate. In our modern world, where constant stimulation surrounds us, the DMN rarely gets a chance to fully express itself. We move from task to task, screen to screen, sound to sound. Our attention is always directed outward, but when silence enters the picture, true silence, where there is nothing to respond to and no one demanding our attention, the brain shifts direction. It turns inward. It begins to process. So what does the DMN actually do? It helps us make sense of ourselves. It pulls together memories, feelings, and ideas. It helps us form a sense of identity, stitching together who we were, who we are, and who we want to become. When you're in this mode, your brain is asking quiet questions. What am I feeling? What did I learn today? What's been weighing on me? What do I need to heal? The default mode network is the theater of your inner life. It's where you play out scenarios, revisit conversations, imagine new possibilities. It's where your mind reviews emotional events, reevaluates decisions, and rebalances itself after stress. Without it, we'd struggle to understand our own thoughts, let alone grow from our experiences. And the quieter the world around you, the more deeply your DMN can work. Interestingly, this part of the brain is also deeply involved in empathy. When you think about another person's emotions, or try to see the world from their perspective, your default mode network comes alive. In silence, you're not just remembering who you are, you're also building your understanding of others. It's the birthplace of compassion, of insight, of meaningful connection. But in a noisy world, this powerful system gets drowned out. Distractions constantly force your brain back into action mode, into quick decisions, shallow reactions, and problem-solving loops. There's no space to reflect, no time to breathe, no room for insight to rise up from the quiet depths. That's why silence is more than just peace. It's more than rest. It's a neurological invitation to return to the self, to reorganize thought, to realign emotion, and to rediscover meaning. When monks enter long periods of silence, when people go on silent retreats, or when you simply unplug and sit in a quiet room for 20 minutes, the default mode network comes to the forefront. And many report feeling more clarity, more emotional balance, more inspiration. That's not a coincidence. It's your brain finally doing the deep work it longs to do. In fact, some studies suggest that when the DMN is disrupted for long periods, such as in people exposed to chronic noise or endless multitasking, mental health can suffer. Anxiety rises, focus declines. A person may feel more scattered, more emotionally flat, even more disconnected from who they truly are. Silence, then, becomes essential not only for calm, but for wholeness. In silence, your brain is not off. It is reorganizing, rebalancing, and reawakening the sense of I. And it's not just cognitive, it's emotional and even spiritual. Those quiet moments are where you begin to feel a sense of belonging within yourself, without the need for constant input or validation. So tonight, as you listen to this, let your thoughts drift. Don't chase them. Don't control them. Let your mind wander like a feather on a still pond. Allow your brain to find its own rhythm in the silence. Let it float through memory, dream, and reflection. Because in that sacred, quiet space, something beautiful is happening. Your default mode network is lighting up, and your true self is quietly finding its voice. Noise is not just something we hear, it's something our entire nervous system feels. Every unexpected sound, every burst of traffic, every buzzing phone, every clattering plate. These are not just interruptions to our ears, they're signals that travel deep into the brain, waking up ancient systems designed to detect danger. Your body doesn't know whether the sound is harmless or not. It reacts anyway. The human brain evolved in a world that was mostly quiet. A rustle in the grass might have meant a predator was near. A crack of a twig could have signaled another human approaching in the dark. Sound, in our early history, was a warning system, something to be taken seriously. That's why, even now, the part of your brain called the amygdala responds instantly to sudden noise. It's always listening, always scanning, always preparing you to fight or flee. This system kept our ancestors alive. But in today's world, where noise is constant and often meaningless, the amygdala never truly rests. Every honking horn or shouting voice or pinging notification sends a tiny jolt through your nervous system. These jolts are so small that you might not even notice them, but over time, they add up. The sympathetic nervous system, the part responsible for stress and readiness, stays partially switched on. Your heart may beat a little faster. Your muscles may stay slightly tense. Your breathing may become shallow without you realizing it. This low-level stress becomes your background setting, and because it never fully switches off, you may begin to feel exhausted, irritable, or anxious without knowing why. Your brain, trying to manage this flood of stimulation, has to work harder. It uses more energy to block out distractions. Your focus becomes strained. Your attention span shortens. Your cognitive load increases, not because you're doing more, but because you're hearing more. This is the hidden weight of modern noise, the invisible tax it places on your mental clarity. Noise doesn't just affect how we feel, it also changes how we think. Studies show that even small amounts of background noise can reduce problem-solving ability, interfere with memory formation, and disrupt verbal reasoning. In school settings, children exposed to chronic noise pollution often show lower reading scores and slower development. In workplaces, even subtle ambient noise can reduce productivity and increase mental fatigue. And it isn't only about volume, it's about unpredictability. Sudden, unpredictable sounds, like a barking dog, a slamming door, or a ringtone, are more damaging than steady background noise, like a waterfall or a fan. That's because the brain struggles with what it cannot predict. Every surprise forces your attention to shift, even for a moment. Over time, this fragments your inner experience. It breaks your flow. It keeps your nervous system on edge. But what's truly remarkable is how the absence of noise, true silence, can begin to undo this damage. In quiet moments, the nervous system starts to reset. The amygdala, no longer activated, begins to calm. Cortisol levels drop. Heart rate and blood pressure normalize. The parasympathetic nervous system takes over, inviting a state of rest, digestion, and recovery. In silence, the brain no longer has to defend itself from sound. It doesn't have to guard against interruption. It can soften its alertness. You might notice your shoulders drop, your jaw relax, your breath deepen without effort. These are the signs that your nervous system is letting go of its armor. These are the signals of safety. And in that state of safety, something beautiful begins to emerge. Mental spaciousness, a kind of clear, open awareness that isn't distracted or defensive. Your thoughts become less reactive. Your emotions feel more balanced. You're no longer just surviving the day, you're present in it. When this clarity begins to return, you may find yourself more able to reflect, to create, to dream. You may begin to remember forgotten thoughts, to feel emotions that have been buried beneath the noise. In this space, you're not just resting, you're recovering the full intelligence of your nervous system, the quiet wisdom that thrives when the world grows still. And so, as you listen now, if there are moments of silence, let them be. Let the quiet settle over you like a warm blanket. Let your brain breathe in the peace it has been missing. There's no need to analyze or judge. Just let the stillness do what it does best. Restore the balance you didn't know had been lost. Rest looks simple on the outside, but inside the brain, rest is a dynamic, complex, and essential process. While it may appear that the brain powers down when you stop working, the opposite is true. Rest is not the absence of activity. It is a different kind of activity, a quieter, deeper kind. One that repairs, consolidates, and reintegrates. When the body is still and the world falls silent, the brain enters a state of remarkable inner motion. In moments of rest, the brain begins to process the countless impressions it absorbed during the day. Every sight, every sound, every word, every emotion, it all leaves a trace. But these traces are fragile, scattered, incomplete. Without rest, they remain as disconnected fragments, hovering in the background of the mind. But when you slow down, when silence takes over, the brain begins to weave them together. The hippocampus, a structure involved in memory and learning, starts replaying recent events in a soft rhythm, transferring them into long-term storage. This isn't just about remembering facts, it's about integrating experience, making meaning, discovering patterns. It's how we begin to understand not just what happened, but why it matters. This process requires a gentle, undisturbed space, one where the brain can focus inward without being pulled in 100 directions. In this state of rest, the prefrontal cortex, the region associated with decision-making and attention, also recalibrates. When overworked, this part of the brain becomes fatigued, leading to mental fog, indecisiveness, and emotional reactivity. But in quiet moments, it begins to recover. Connections between brain regions strengthen. Neural pathways that were frayed by stress begin to rewire. In silence, even a short period of rest can restore a surprising amount of mental clarity. There is also a deeper kind of rest happening, one that is not just cognitive, but cellular. The brain is an energy-intensive organ. It uses about 20% of the body's total energy, even though it makes up only a small percentage of your weight. To function well, it needs time to clean itself. During rest, the glymphatic system becomes more active. This is a network of channels that clears away waste products from brain cells, byproducts of thinking, processing, and reacting. If left unflushed, these waste materials can build up, slowing communication between neurons and contributing to mental exhaustion. The most powerful rest occurs when we are no longer overstimulated, when there is nothing demanding our reaction. That is why silence is such a potent ally in the process of restoration. In silence, the mind no longer has to defend itself. It can open up, not in effort, but in release. The act of listening to nothing, of simply being, allows the brain to turn inward, away from the flood of external signals. This inward state is deeply meditative, even if it doesn't look like meditation. It's what happens when you sit with a cup of tea and watch the steam curl upward, when you lie under a tree and listen to leaves rustling in the breeze, when you pause in the middle of your day and allow yourself 5 minutes of stillness. In those moments, your brain is resting, but it's also doing something profound. It's finding itself again beneath the noise. And as this deeper rest unfolds, it begins to influence the entire nervous system. The heart rate synchronizes with the breath. Stress hormones begin to decrease. Muscular tension loosens its grip. The vagus nerve, which connects the brain to the body's internal organs, becomes more active, enhancing digestion, emotional regulation, and immune response. Rest, it turns out, is not passive. It's a full-body act of renewal. This is why we often feel wiser, calmer, and more open after a period of quiet. It's not just that we've taken a break. It's that something inside us has rebalanced. Something essential has clicked back into place. And once the brain has had this chance to pause and restore, it becomes more receptive, more focused, and more alive to the next moment that comes. Silence isn't just a poetic idea or a relaxing atmosphere. It's a scientifically measurable phenomenon with real, observable effects on the brain. When researchers look into the science of quiet moments, they discover something unexpected. Silence is not empty at all. It's a rich and active environment capable of transforming neural pathways, influencing chemistry and shaping thought patterns in ways we are only beginning to understand. In laboratory studies, scientists have found that even just 2 minutes of pure silence can be more calming to the nervous system than listening to soothing music. While music can slow the heart and calm the breath, silence goes further. It reaches deeper into the brain's stress circuitry and signals something profoundly different: safety. It tells the brain that it's okay to let go, that there's no threat to scan for, no voice to interpret, no demand to answer. This absence of input becomes a kind of invitation for the body to soften and for the mind to shift into a new gear. Brain scans show that during silence, several regions of the brain begin to light up in specific ways. The default mode network becomes active, gently linking the past and present through reflection. The prefrontal cortex gets a chance to rest and reorient. Even the auditory cortex, the part of your brain responsible for interpreting sound, begins to tune inward, processing internal signals instead of external noise. It's almost as if silence flips the direction of consciousness. Instead of scanning the outer world, the brain begins to listen inward. But there's something even more surprising. Silence doesn't just create calm, it may also support the growth of new brain cells. In a groundbreaking study, researchers exposed mice to 2 hours of silence each day and found that, unlike other sound conditions, silence led to the development of new neurons in the hippocampus, a part of the brain involved in memory, learning, and emotional regulation. While this doesn't mean silence is a magic cure for memory loss, it hints at something powerful. That quiet may actually nourish the brain in ways we cannot fully see or feel in the moment. This silent nourishment may be why we often emerge from quiet moments with fresh ideas, with problems that suddenly seem simpler, or with a strange sense that something has shifted inside us. The mind, left to its own rhythm, seems to find a kind of order in the stillness. Thoughts become untangled, emotions settle into their rightful place, questions lose their urgency. Even the body begins to mirror this reorganization. Blood pressure decreases, heart rate stabilizes, cortisol levels drop, and a sense of gentle spaciousness begins to fill the chest. In silence, the entire system, mind and body, enters coherence. This is not the same as being idle or bored. It's not emptiness. It's a profound form of processing, a subtle recalibration of the whole being. And what makes this especially important is how rare it has become. In a world flooded with sound, constant conversation, background music, podcasts, alerts, traffic, true silence is an endangered experience. We've been trained to fill every gap with stimulation, to avoid empty space. But the science is clear. It is in those empty spaces that the brain does some of its most essential work. The silence of a quiet morning, the hush of a dark room, the stillness of a late-night walk. These aren't just restful moments. They are biological gifts, windows through which the brain can return to itself. And when we allow them, when we stop running from the quiet and instead step willingly into it, we begin to access a deeper level of mental functioning, one that doesn't just help us feel calm, but helps us feel whole. Even brief periods of silence throughout the day can accumulate into real neurological benefits. Pausing before a meeting, turning off the radio during a drive, sitting without a phone for a few minutes in the evening, these micro moments allow the brain to reset, to catch up with itself, to integrate rather than react. In this integration, there's space for everything we've missed while moving too fast. Ideas, feelings, truths that have been waiting beneath the surface for a moment of quiet to rise. And it's here, in the middle of this still, invisible transformation, that the brain begins to remember something ancient and essential. That life is not just about input, but also about absorption. That what truly matters often arrives in a whisper. That some of the most meaningful insights don't shout to be heard. They wait in silence until you're ready to listen. Noise pollution is often thought of as a minor inconvenience, a passing annoyance in a crowded city, a background hum we learn to live with. But in truth, it is one of the most underestimated sources of chronic stress in modern life. Unlike a visible threat or a single traumatic event, noise pollution works slowly, invisibly, and persistently. It wears down the mind, drains the nervous system, and alters the chemistry of the brain without us even noticing until we begin to feel overwhelmed, disconnected, or fatigued for reasons we can't quite name. What makes noise pollution particularly harmful is its constant presence. It doesn't have to be loud to do damage. In fact, the most harmful types of noise are the ones that never truly stop. Traffic murmurs, airplane drones, the mechanical growl of HVAC systems, distant conversations bleeding through walls, the hum of electronics that never sleep. These are not occasional disturbances. They are environmental conditions that many people live with every single day. And because the brain is designed to be alert to sound for survival, it can never fully ignore them. Even when you think you've tuned them out, your nervous system is still responding. This persistent low-level noise activates the body's stress response, triggering the release of cortisol and adrenaline. Over time, this leads to elevated blood pressure, disrupted sleep cycles, tension in the muscles, and a heightened state of arousal that becomes the new normal. The sympathetic nervous system, the part of your body responsible for action and vigilance, remains partially activated, making it harder to truly relax, to concentrate, or to find a sense of inner quiet. This isn't just about comfort, it's about long-term health. For children, the effects are even more pronounced. In schools located near airports or busy highways, studies have found that students exposed to chronic noise pollution experience delayed cognitive development, lower reading comprehension, and decreased attention spans. Their brains, still in the process of forming crucial connections, are constantly interrupted by the invisible background of sonic chaos. Even at home, the same effects can be seen in neighborhoods where noise is a constant companion, whether from nearby train tracks, loud neighbors, or urban sprawl. And the psychological impact is just as powerful as the physiological. Constant noise disrupts our sense of control. It makes us feel powerless because we can't shut it off or get away from it. This feeling of helplessness, of having no say in your own sensory environment, creates a subtle but enduring sense of anxiety. It wears down resilience and increases irritability. In places where noise is a regular feature of life, people report higher rates of depression, insomnia, and burnout. The brain, without rest, without silence, becomes inflamed, mentally and emotionally. But perhaps the most concerning effect of chronic noise is how it dulls our capacity to feel. When we live in overstimulated environments, our internal world begins to shut down to protect itself. We become numb not just to sound, but to everything, Emotions flatten, thought patterns become rigid, creativity dries up, our reactions become mechanical, and we begin to confuse noise with life, believing that constant input means we are staying connected, staying productive, staying alive. But in reality, we are simply overstimulated and undernourished, running on an emotional and mental deficit that we've grown used to carrying. Silence, by contrast, reintroduces us to something we forgot we were missing. When noise pollution fades, even for a moment, the brain has a chance to breathe. It reawakens its sensitivity. Sounds become more vivid, not because they are louder, but because you are no longer numb. Emotions that have been buried beneath 1,000 distractions begin to stir again. Thoughts begin to slow down, to spread out, to find their own rhythm. You begin to realize how much mental space had been stolen from you by the constant, invisible drone of modern life. And as the background noise fades, what emerges in its place is presence. Not just being in a place physically, but being there mentally, emotionally, spiritually. You begin to hear the subtler sounds again, the whisper of leaves, the tiny creaks of the house settling, the rhythm of your own breath. These aren't just sounds, they are anchors. They pull you back to the here and now. They remind your nervous system what calm feels like. They remind your soul that it's safe to return to the surface. Even brief exposure to quiet, natural spaces, parks, forests, quiet rooms with open windows, can undo some of the damage caused by chronic noise. Your body remembers what it feels like to relax. Your mind begins to let go of its defensive posture. Silence doesn't have to be total for the healing to begin. It just has to be deep enough, long enough, consistent enough to signal to your brain, you are safe, you are allowed to rest, and you are no longer under siege. The brain is not designed for constant stimulation. It is designed for rhythm, an ebb and flow between input and rest, between engagement and reflection, between sound and silence. Just as your lungs need both the inhale and the exhale, your mind needs moments of quiet to balance out the noise of living. And when that balance is lost, when the scales tip too far into the realm of relentless activity and sensory overload, the brain begins to show signs of fatigue. It becomes tired, not just in the physical sense, but in a deeper, more spiritual way. That is when you begin to crave silence, even if you don't realize it. This craving is subtle. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it appears as irritability or a sudden need to withdraw. Sometimes it shows up as a lack of focus or a strange feeling of emotional emptiness, even after a day full of activity. And sometimes it's a deeper kind of exhaustion, the sense that no matter how much you sleep or how much you distract yourself, you still feel unrested. This is the brain's way of asking for stillness. It is asking not for more information, not for more entertainment, but for space. Space to process, to breathe, to remember itself. The brain craves silence in the same way the body craves water or the skin craves sunlight. It is not a luxury or a break. It is a biological necessity. When deprived of silence for too long, the brain begins to operate in survival mode. It becomes reactive instead of reflective. It begins to prioritize short-term thinking over long-term insight. The imagination dulls. Empathy contracts. Decision-making becomes more impulsive. The inner landscape of thought, normally rich, nuanced, and layered, flattens into a kind of mental noise, just as chaotic as the world outside. But when silence is reintroduced, the shift is almost immediate. The mind, like dry soil meeting rain, begins to absorb the stillness. Thoughts slow down. The inner monologue becomes quieter, more coherent. You begin to notice patterns you hadn't seen before. Connections between ideas, the subtle rise and fall of your own emotions, the background of your mind that is always whispering, even when you're too busy to listen. In this space, the brain finds relief. It doesn't have to perform. It doesn't have to react. It can simply be. And this being is not idle. It is deeply active in its own way. The brain uses silence to regulate mood, to strengthen memory, to recalibrate attention. It is during these quiet moments that your nervous system restores equilibrium, that your emotional self finds grounding, that your psychological health begins to strengthen at its roots. The craving for silence is the brain's instinctive movement toward healing, toward integration, toward wholeness. Modern life tries to override this instinct. We are surrounded by systems and habits that reward stimulation, that encourage constant input. Productivity is valued over presence, noise over nuance. We carry devices that offer a never-ending stream of sound, music, podcasts, notifications, background videos playing in every room. It's easy to go days, even weeks, without experiencing a moment of real silence. And yet, deep down, the brain remembers. It remembers the natural rhythm it was built for. It remembers the sanctuary that stillness provides. This is why certain places feel instantly calming. A quiet forest, a still lake, a dimly lit library. These spaces resonate with something old and wise inside us. They echo the conditions under which the human brain evolved. Spaces where alertness could relax into awareness, where the mind could listen inward instead of outward, where consciousness could stretch and settle without interruption. In these places, the brain is not just comfortable, it is home. When you step into silence, you are not stepping into emptiness. You are stepping into the fullness of yourself, the fullness that is often hidden behind the mental clutter, the external noise, the constant race to do and to know. In silence, you begin to re-inhabit the spaces inside you that were once crowded out by noise. You begin to feel the presence of your own mind, not as a machine of productivity, but as a living, breathing field of awareness. And the more you return to silence, the more familiar it becomes. What once felt uncomfortable or boring begins to feel nourishing, expansive, and deeply human. Memory is not a fixed recording stored neatly in the corners of the brain. It's alive. It shifts, rewrites, strengthens, and fades depending on how we treat it, depending on the mental environment we create for it to grow. And one of the most powerful environments for memory to thrive in is silence. In the absence of noise, the mind turns inward. It begins sorting, organizing, and integrating the endless stream of experiences we've taken in throughout the day. Silence is not just helpful for memory, it's essential to how memory is built and sustained. During silent moments, especially those following a period of learning or intense activity, the brain begins to replay what it has absorbed. This is not the kind of replay we do consciously. It's quieter, deeper, automatic. It happens beneath awareness, like waves smoothing over footprints in the sand. The hippocampus, the part of the brain responsible for forming new memories, becomes active in silence. linking together fragments of experience and converting them into lasting impressions. These are not just the facts and figures we've learned, but also the emotions we felt, the patterns we noticed, the connections we formed between different ideas. In the silence that follows learning, the brain essentially says, "Now I can begin to make sense of this." It begins the slow and complex process of consolidation, turning short-term traces into long-term structures. But this process is fragile. It needs uninterrupted space. It needs the absence of new input, the absence of distraction, the absence of sudden sound that might pull the mind away from its quiet work. When silence is broken too soon, memory consolidation can be interrupted. The information remains partial, fragmented, or is forgotten altogether. This is why many people find that their best ideas, their clearest thoughts, or their deepest understandings don't happen during a lesson, a book, or a conversation, but after. Often in the quiet moments that follow. A walk in solitude, a few minutes of staring out the window, a silent car ride, or simply sitting alone with nothing but your breath. These are the moments when the brain, free from demand, begins to unpack what it has learned. It starts stitching together the experience with memory, linking it to existing knowledge, testing it against emotion, and ultimately finding a place for it to live. Even sleep plays a part in this. The deeper stages of sleep, especially those accompanied by silence and stillness before bedtime, are powerful periods of memory processing. But if we go to bed filled with noise, literal noise from screens and voices, or mental noise from unresolved thoughts, the quality of this memory work declines. The brain stays in a kind of limbo, caught between trying to rest and trying to keep up with unfinished processing. That's why creating silence around moments of transition, before sleep, after learning, during reflection, is not a luxury. It's a way to give memory the time and space it needs to mature. There is also something about silence that allows emotional memories to be re-examined more gently. In the absence of external input, we often find ourselves returning to old memories, not in a forced way, but as if they arise naturally, seeking closure or reprocessing. A conversation from years ago, a moment we regret, a joy we haven't fully felt. These memories, when revisited in silence, are not distorted by noise or emotional urgency. They become softer, clearer, easier to understand. The brain, left to its own rhythms, begins to reinterpret them, to learn from them in new ways. What once felt confusing may now make sense. What once felt painful may begin to feel like something we've survived, something that shaped us. In silence, memory is not just about the past, it becomes a tool for healing and integration. It allows the brain to reflect not only on what has happened, but on what it means. And this meaning-making process is what gives us continuity. It helps us form a stable sense of self, a coherent life story, a sense of direction. Without the time and space for memory to settle and unfold, we begin to feel scattered. Our experiences pass through us without leaving anything solid behind. Even in the most advanced classrooms and training programs, studies show that what helps people retain information the most is not intensity or repetition. It is the presence of restful periods afterward, pauses, gaps, moments of quiet. These aren't breaks from learning, they are learning. They are where the mind integrates, where understanding deepens, where insight forms. And it's not just about learning facts. Silence helps us remember who we are. It allows the deeper memories, the ones that form our identity, our values, our quiet beliefs, to resurface. The memories of childhood moments, forgotten dreams, turning points we didn't recognize at the time. In the silence, these memories find their way back, not as distractions, but as reminders. Reminders of where we've come from, and perhaps even where we're meant to go. There is a kind of thinking that only appears when we are not trying to think. A soft, meandering stream of thought that doesn't force itself into conclusions, that doesn't rush toward answers. It drifts, it loops, it explores. This is the experience of mind wandering, a natural mental rhythm that so often arises in silence. When the world goes quiet and the immediate tasks fall away, the mind begins to move inward and outward in unpredictable, creative, and deeply human ways. For a long time, mind wandering was seen as a kind of mental mistake, something unproductive, even lazy. In school, we were told to pay attention, to stay focused, to stop daydreaming. But science now tells us a different story. It turns out that when our thoughts wander, especially during quiet moments, our brains are engaging in some of their most sophisticated and meaningful activity. We simulate the future. We review the past. We work through problems in abstract ways. We make sense of emotions. We even practice empathy by imagining how others might feel. And none of this is random. It all happens under the radar, often when we least expect it. Silence creates the ideal conditions for this to happen. Without the constant tug of external noise, the brain is no longer chained to the immediate environment. It begins to roam freely, connecting distant ideas, surfacing forgotten memories, and weaving together thoughts that seemed unrelated. The mind, unburdened by deadlines and distractions, enters a state of openness. And in this openness, creativity blossoms, not in a flash of inspiration, but in a slow unfolding of insight. Mind wandering during silence is not just about imagination, it's also about problem solving. Studies show that when people take breaks from hard tasks and enter a quiet, inward state, they are more likely to return to those tasks with fresh solutions. The answer that felt just out of reach before may now feel obvious. This is because the brain, given time and space, continues to work on problems in the background. It takes a different route, less direct, less linear, but often more effective. The insight that emerges after silence is not forced. It arises organically, almost as if it was always waiting there, just beneath the surface. This wandering state is also essential for emotional processing. When we're constantly engaged, constantly stimulated, we have little room to feel what we're feeling. Emotions get buried under activity, but in the quiet, when our thoughts begin to drift, emotions often come along for the ride. We may suddenly feel a wave of sadness, or a moment of unexpected joy, or a memory that brings a smile or a tear. These aren't interruptions, they're integrations. Mind wandering gives the emotional brain time to catch up, to make sense of the weight it's been carrying, to find a place for unprocessed feelings. And as we wander through this internal space, we also touch on identity. Who we are, who we've been, who we're becoming. In the structured world of tasks and obligations, it's easy to lose track of these questions. But when silence arrives and our thoughts are free to drift, these deeper reflections tend to surface. They don't demand immediate answers. They just emerge, quietly shaping how we see ourselves and how we move forward. Mind wandering in silence is not aimless. It is exploratory. It's how the brain finds new perspectives without being told what to look for. It's how the soul stretches its legs after being confined for too long. And it's something we've always done, even before we had words for it. Ancient humans, sitting by the fire after a long day of hunting or gathering, likely let their minds drift just the same, imagining, wondering, remembering, hoping. The modern world may have changed the scenery, but it hasn't changed this basic human need. Even moments that seem entirely ordinary, waiting in line, staring out the window on a train, lying in bed before sleep, can become doorways to this inner wandering. If we let them, if we resist the urge to fill them with noise, if we welcome the quiet instead of fearing it, because in that quiet, the mind begins its journey, not toward escape, but toward depth, not toward distraction, but toward discovery. And there, in that silent wandering, the brain finds something it can't find in the noise, its own voice. A voice that is gentle, curious, sometimes conflicted, often surprising, but always worth listening to. The brain is a magnificent organ, but it is not a machine that can run endlessly without rest. Every moment of experience, every sound, image, decision, and emotional reaction creates tiny traces of activity in the brain. These traces build up over time, forming pathways, impressions, chemical byproducts, and even cellular waste. While we go about our daily lives absorbing the world through our senses, something else is quietly happening beneath the surface, a buildup of mental residue. And just as the body needs to eliminate waste to stay healthy, the brain also needs time and space to cleanse itself. Silence becomes one of the most powerful tools for this invisible form of purification. Neuroscientists have discovered that the brain contains a remarkable system called the glymphatic system, a cleansing network that removes toxins and metabolic waste from neural tissues. It's somewhat similar to the lymphatic system in the rest of the body, but specifically designed to protect and maintain brain function. The glymphatic system is especially active during rest and sleep, and most effective when the brain is in a calm, undistracted state. This is where silence comes in. When the world around us quiets down and the mind slips into a restful rhythm, the glymphatic system begins to open its channels and clear out what has accumulated. Tiny particles left behind by neural activity, proteins, molecular waste, and excess neurotransmitters are washed away, giving the brain a clean slate to work from. But it's not only physical toxins that need to be cleared. Mental clutter, the fog that builds from overstimulation, emotional overload, and chronic multitasking, also accumulates. This clutter isn't as easy to measure in a lab, but we feel it. We feel it when our thoughts are jumbled, when we can't seem to focus, when we lose track of our priorities, or feel weighed down by an unexplainable heaviness. The mind begins to feel crowded, noisy, disorganized. We try to push through it, to work harder, to stay productive. But often, the most effective solution is not more effort, it's more silence. Silence allows the mind to pause its constant intake and begin the slow work of release. In silence, thoughts can rise without competition. Emotions can stretch out and complete their arc. Half-formed ideas can either find shape or dissolve. There's no need to force clarity. It emerges naturally when the pressure is lifted. This is the detox process of the mind. A gentle, almost imperceptible cleansing that can only happen when the noise dies down. One of the most fascinating effects of silence is its impact on the brain's default mode network, the system that becomes active during restful introspection. While this network is working, we revisit memories, imagine the future, and integrate experiences into a coherent sense of self. But this process also includes sorting, discarding what's no longer needed, releasing mental loops that don't serve us, breaking repetitive thought patterns that keep us stuck. Without moments of quiet, this sorting function becomes overloaded. The brain tries to manage everything at once, and it begins to slow down, becoming reactive instead of reflective. Many people describe the experience of returning from a silent retreat, or even just spending a day in nature without noise, as feeling lighter, not in a physical sense, but mentally and emotionally. This lightness isn't just a change in mood, it's the result of having let go of things they didn't even realize they were carrying. Silent time allows the mind to drop what it doesn't need, worries that were only half real, opinions that don't belong to us, regrets that have already taught their lesson. In the same way that the body cannot digest without rest, the brain cannot integrate life without pause. Every experience, every conversation, every moment of conflict or joy creates inner residue. Some of it is valuable. Some of it is just leftover noise. Silence is the tool that helps us separate the two. It's like stepping into a still lake after walking through dust and wind. The water doesn't shout, doesn't instruct, doesn't even move much, but it cleanses just by being still, and this stillness has a rhythm. The more we allow silence into our lives, the more we begin to feel the brain finding its own pace again. Not the frantic rhythm of deadlines and notifications, but the deeper rhythm of insight, intuition, and inner truth. This rhythm can't be forced or rushed. It reveals itself slowly as the clutter fades, as the static clears, as the mind rediscovers its own clarity beneath the surface. When you step into silence, you are not just taking a break from the outside world. You are giving the brain permission to heal, to flush out what it no longer needs, to reset its systems. It is an act of internal housekeeping, a clearing out of the emotional and cognitive debris that keeps us stuck in loops of fatigue and confusion. It's in this silent housekeeping that we begin to feel more at home in our own minds again. The dust settles, the noise fades, and in the space that remains, something essential begins to rise. When the world becomes quiet, something remarkable begins to happen inside the brain. Systems that are usually preoccupied with responding to external demands suddenly turn inward. The nervous system slows its defenses. The brain begins to restore itself, not just through chemical processes or rest, but through deep structural renewal. In these moments of profound stillness, a subtle kind of rebuilding occurs. The brain starts to repair connections, reinforce weakened circuits, and even generate new cells. Silence becomes not just a break from noise, but a fertile ground for regeneration. One of the most extraordinary discoveries in neuroscience over the last few decades is the concept of neurogenesis, the brain's ability to grow new neurons, particularly in the hippocampus, which is crucial for learning, memory, and emotional regulation. While neurogenesis is influenced by many factors like sleep, exercise, and nutrition, silence appears to play an unexpected but powerful role in supporting this process. In studies with animals, researchers found that periods of silence, just 2 hours per day, led to increased growth of new brain cells. This discovery is still being explored, but it opens a fascinating doorway. That stillness may be biologically restorative in ways we're only beginning to understand. Silence also reduces the overall load on the brain's sensory processing centers. Normally, every sound we hear must be interpreted. Even if we are not actively paying attention, the auditory system is always alert, always scanning. It's a deeply ingrained survival mechanism, one that once helped us detect danger in the wild. But in modern life, this constant vigilance becomes exhausting. The brain is flooded with input. It doesn't have time to process. This overstimulation can create microdamage, not in the form of visible injury, but in overstretched neurons, exhausted synapses, and hormonal imbalances that throw the brain's natural rhythm off course. When we enter silence, we allow the brain to step back from its constant monitoring. In that withdrawal, energy is redirected from reacting to repairing. This restoration is not just chemical, it's emotional. Chronic exposure to noise has been linked with anxiety, aggression, and even symptoms of depression. But the opposite is also true. Silence has been shown to lower cortisol levels, reduce tension in the body, and improve mood. When the amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm system, is no longer being constantly triggered by environmental stresses, it begins to cool. Its messages become less frantic, less reactive. The entire emotional system softens. In this softer space, healing begins. Emotional wounds that were too loud to be heard in the chaos of daily life start to speak, gently and clearly. In silence, the prefrontal cortex, our center of reason, decision-making, and self-control, has a chance to rest and reset. This region is responsible for many of the functions that define us as human beings: planning, empathy, moral judgment, awareness of self. But it is also one of the most energy-intensive parts of the brain, and it tires easily. Under constant pressure, it begins to falter, leading to impulsive decisions, clouded judgment, and emotional reactivity. Silence offers the prefrontal cortex the space it needs to recover its clarity. Like a muscle that's been overworked, it begins to regain its strength, not through more effort, but through stillness. Even the brain's connectivity, the vast web of neurons linking different areas, begins to reorganize in silence. Functional MRI scans show that during quiet rest, the brain's networks begin to operate in more coherent patterns. Regions that had become isolated or overwhelmed start to synchronize again. It's as if the brain is resetting its internal communication system, like tuning instruments in an orchestra. The resulting harmony may not be something we consciously feel right away, but over time, it manifests as a sense of mental alignment. Thoughts flow more clearly. Emotions feel more understandable. The inner world becomes navigable once again. This inner rebuilding affects our perception too. When the brain is overstimulated, it becomes numb to subtlety. It loses the ability to detect nuance in sound, in color, in emotion, in meaning. But as silence takes hold, sensitivity returns. We begin to notice the fine textures of life again, the softness of a breeze, the distant rhythm of our breath, the gentle stirrings of intuition. This isn't just about external awareness, it's about regaining our capacity for presence. Silence repairs not only the brain's structure, but its relationship with the moment. We stop racing past experience and begin to enter it fully. In many spiritual traditions, Silence is not just rest, it is sacred. It is where the divine speaks, where inner wisdom arises, where transformation begins. And from a neurological perspective, this reverence makes sense. Silence allows the brain to become a vessel again. Emptied of noise, it becomes receptive, not just to thought, but to insight. Not just to information, but to understanding. It is in this receptive state that some of our most important healing occurs. Not just recovery from stress, but the deep repair of who we are. And while the outer world may continue to demand our attention, even short, intentional moments of silence throughout the day can create these effects. A few minutes of quiet before a conversation, a pause before responding, a slow walk without a phone. These small spaces open the door to renewal. The brain does not require hours of silence at a time to begin its repair. It only requires sincerity, a true, uninterrupted pause, a moment where nothing is needed from it, and it is free to return to its natural rhythm. Because in that rhythm, the brain remembers what it was made for, not just to think or to act, but to reflect, to feel, to grow, to heal. And in the gentle stillness of silence, it begins this process without fanfare, without sound, and often without our conscious awareness. But the effects remain, quietly reshaping us from the inside out. Creativity does not flourish in chaos. It blooms in stillness, in the long spaces between moments, in the gaps where nothing seems to be happening. This is where the creative mind stretches out, breathes deeply, and begins to form connections that weren't visible before. When the world goes quiet, and the brain is no longer bombarded with noise, the imagination begins to awaken, not with effort, but with ease, not with pressure, but with curiosity. Silence becomes a fertile ground where seeds of ideas can take root, grow, and blossom into something unexpected. The creative process is often misunderstood. Many believe it begins with inspiration, a sudden spark, a brilliant idea that lights up the mind. But in truth, creativity often begins with emptiness. It begins with a blank canvas, a quiet room, a mind that has finally stopped spinning. In this quiet emptiness, the brain starts to search, not frantically, but playfully. It wanders through memories, emotions, colors, sensations. It loops through old images and unspoken thoughts. It asks, what if? And in asking that question without urgency, it begins to create. Silence nurtures this process by removing the noise that interrupts it. Every beep of a phone, every external demand, every fragment of conversation pulls the brain away from the deep, meandering work of creativity. These small distractions are not just interruptions. They are fractures in the mental landscape. They force the mind to reorient again and again, draining the very energy it needs to imagine, to invent, to dream. In contrast, silence provides continuity. It offers a long, uninterrupted space where the mind can build something slowly, carefully, layer by layer. Neurologically, this process is supported by a network of brain regions that thrive in quiet reflection. The default mode network, for example, is deeply involved in creative thinking. It helps the brain retrieve distant memories, make nonlinear associations, and simulate alternative realities. It doesn't work well under pressure. It doesn't respond to noise or instruction. It needs space. It needs silence. In these quiet conditions, the brain becomes a kind of inner theater. Ideas float in, merge, split apart, reappear in new forms. What seems like aimless drifting is, in fact, a complex act of synthesis. The brain is combining pieces of experience in new and beautiful ways. This is why some of the most creative moments in history came during solitude. Great thinkers, writers, composers, and scientists all sought out silence, not because they were avoiding the world, but because they were returning to something deeper. Beethoven took long, silent walks. Virginia Woolf wrote about the importance of a room of one's own. Einstein spoke of how his greatest insights came not during work, but during quiet daydreams. Their silence was not empty. It was filled with listening. Listening not to the outside, but to the murmur of their own minds. Creativity also depends on incubation. An idea, once formed, needs time to rest. It needs space to evolve in the background, to be refined and reshaped by unconscious thought. Silence is the womb where this incubation occurs. Without silence, ideas remain raw and reactive. With silence, they deepen. They become layered with meaning. They find their shape not through force, but through patience. Emotional safety also plays a role. In a noisy, judgmental environment, creativity withers. The brain becomes defensive, cautious, unwilling to take risks. But in silence, true, accepting, non-judgmental silence, the mind feels safe enough to experiment. There is no need to impress, no fear of being misunderstood. There is only space. And in that space, even the most fragile ideas are free to take form. Silence also enhances the sensory imagination. When external sound disappears, the inner senses sharpen. Visual imagery becomes more vivid. Inner dialogue grows more nuanced. The brain begins to recall the texture of a leaf, the sound of a forgotten song, the scent of a summer afternoon. These sensory fragments, often buried beneath the noise of daily life, become the building blocks of creative expression. They return in silence, not as memories alone, but as raw material for new creations. And perhaps most importantly, silence helps us hear what we truly care about. Creative work that resonates deeply, the kind that moves people, the kind that carries truth, is born not from trend or urgency, but from stillness. It comes from listening to the quiet pulse of something meaningful inside, something that can't be heard when the mind is shouting. Silence strips away the distractions and reveals the question beneath all others. What do I truly want to say? This question does not always have an immediate answer. But in silence, the answer begins to form. It begins with fragments, whispers, half-formed images. And if we stay with it, if we resist the urge to fill the silence with noise or certainty, those fragments begin to align. They become rhythm, structure, emotion, form. The invisible becomes visible. The silent becomes spoken. The mind, once quieted, begins to sing. In the hushed atmosphere of deep silence, something extraordinary takes place, something far more than peace or calm. Beneath the stillness, hidden from our immediate awareness, the brain may actually be growing, not metaphorically, but biologically. One of the most fascinating discoveries in modern neuroscience is that silence, more than many forms of sensory input, can stimulate the birth of new brain cells, a process known as neurogenesis. And this birth takes place in one of the most important regions of the brain, the hippocampus. The hippocampus is deeply involved in memory, learning, and emotional regulation. It is a structure of curved tissue located in the temporal lobe, and it plays a crucial role in forming new memories, navigating through space, and interpreting emotional experiences. But what makes the hippocampus even more remarkable is its ability to generate new neurons throughout life. Unlike other parts of the brain that mostly stabilize after development, the hippocampus retains a unique plasticity. It is sensitive, responsive, and under the right conditions, regenerative. Silence appears to be one of those conditions. In studies conducted on animals, researchers were surprised to discover that periods of silence, not music, not white noise, not even calming sounds, but pure, undisturbed silence, resulted in a marked increase in the development of new neurons in the hippocampus. The effect was not just psychological, it was structural. New cells were being born, integrated into the network, and prepared to support future cognitive and emotional tasks. It suggested something profound, that silence is not simply restful, but constructive. The mechanisms behind this are still being studied, but some theories suggest that silence provides a kind of low-stress, high-safety environment for the brain. In this state, the nervous system lowers its defenses, metabolic functions stabilize, and the hormonal environment becomes more favorable for growth. Neurotrophic factors, proteins that support neuron development and survival, are more likely to be produced when the body is in a relaxed, parasympathetic state. And silence, perhaps more than any other environmental factor, activates this state of inner calm. But it's not just about growing new brain cells. It's about giving those cells the chance to become something meaningful. In order for a new neuron to survive and integrate into the brain's network, it must be used. It must be woven into patterns of thought, memory, attention, or emotion. Silence provides the space for this to happen. In silence, the brain is not distracted. It has the time to explore new connections, to reshape circuits, to give emerging neurons a role in conscious experience. This isn't something we feel directly. It doesn't come with fireworks or fanfare, but over time, this silent shaping results in something tangible: sharper memory, improved emotional balance, greater learning capacity, and a deeper sense of internal coherence. This silent neurogenesis has emotional implications as well. The hippocampus is closely connected with the amygdala, the brain's center for processing fear and threat. When the hippocampus is healthy and active, it helps to contextualize fear, to put it into perspective, to regulate how we respond to emotional triggers. When the hippocampus is damaged or underdeveloped, such as through chronic stress or trauma, fear responses become exaggerated. We become more reactive, more anxious, more stuck in cycles of rumination. Silence, by supporting hippocampal growth, may help to rebalance this relationship. It may give the brain the tools it needs to break out of old patterns of emotional overwhelm. What's even more fascinating is that the experience of silence doesn't have to be long or dramatic to produce these effects. Even short periods, moments carved out during a walk, a quiet afternoon, a pause in conversation, can begin to shift the brain's internal environment. These moments are like windows through which the mind can breathe. Each window of silence opens a space for the brain to reset, to rebuild, to begin again. And this rebuilding is not just physical or mental, it touches something deeper. The birth of new neurons mirrors, in a quiet way, the birth of new ideas, new insights, new ways of being. It is as if the brain, in the presence of stillness, remembers its capacity for change. It remembers that growth is possible even in the most unlikely conditions, that life continues, invisibly, underneath the surface. Silence, then, is not an absence. It is a presence, a nourishing presence that gives the brain permission to evolve, to repair, and to expand. It does not demand anything. It does not perform. It simply offers the conditions for something new to emerge. The brain responds not with noise or energy, but with delicate precision, silently weaving new cells into the web of experience, silently becoming more whole with each quiet breath. There is a rhythm beneath our thoughts, a pulse that doesn't come from the heart, but from the brain itself. This rhythm is made of electrical waves, tiny oscillations of energy that travel through neurons like invisible tides. Among these, one particular type of brainwave has long been associated with quiet alertness, calm focus, and a soft, open awareness, the alpha wave. And silence, more than any other condition, creates the perfect environment for alpha brainwaves to rise and spread. Alpha waves typically range between 8 and 12 Hz. They are strongest when we are in a relaxed, wakeful state, not quite sleeping, not fully concentrating, but somewhere in between. This state is familiar to most of us, even if we don't have a name for it. It's what we experience when we close our eyes and breathe deeply, when we take a quiet walk in nature, when we stare at the clouds without thinking. It's a state where the mind is no longer gripped by urgency, but isn't drifting into sleep either. It floats gently, loosely tethered to the moment. In silence, this alpha state becomes easier to access. When the world quiets down, when there is no demand for reaction, no competition for attention, the brain naturally shifts from the high-frequency beta waves associated with active thought and stress to the slower, smoother alpha waves. This shift doesn't just feel peaceful, it brings with it a cascade of neurological benefits. Attention becomes more stable, emotions become easier to regulate, the brain becomes more receptive to new ideas, more sensitive to internal cues, more in tune with the present moment. Alpha waves serve as a bridge between the conscious and subconscious mind. In high stimulation environments, the brain often gets stuck in a beta-dominant state, fast, focused, and sometimes anxious. But when alpha waves increase, the brain becomes more flexible. It opens the door to internal imagery, intuition, and creative association. It becomes easier to listen inward, to reflect, to access information that isn't just logical but meaningful. This is why silence can feel like a portal, not into emptiness but into depth. In silence, alpha waves guide the mind gently downward into slower and more resonant modes of being. These waves are not isolated. They influence the entire brain. When alpha activity increases in the occipital lobes, visual processing slows down, making it easier to close your eyes and turn your attention inward. When alpha waves rise in the frontal cortex, decision-making becomes more measured, less impulsive. There is less chatter in the mind, fewer distractions, more space between thoughts. time begins to stretch. A few quiet minutes can feel like a vast, spacious moment. This is the experience many describe during meditation or mindfulness practice. But it can also be accessed through simple silence, no technique, no effort, just quiet awareness. Interestingly, alpha waves also help inhibit irrelevant or intrusive information. In a world filled with constant noise and interruption, this becomes critical. Alpha rhythms act like a gentle filter, allowing the brain to suppress what it doesn't need and focus on what truly matters. They create a sort of mental boundary, protecting the inner world from being overwhelmed by the outer one. In this way, silence is not just soothing, it is protective. It supports the brain's ability to maintain integrity, to stay whole in the face of fragmentation. There's also evidence that alpha activity enhances learning. When we are calm and alert, the brain is more plastic, more capable of forming new connections. This is why learning after periods of rest or in quiet environments is often more effective than learning under stress. Silence helps the brain slip into the ideal frequency for absorption. It becomes a sponge, not through force, but through receptivity. Alpha waves allow information to settle in without resistance. And when learning is tied to emotional meaning, alpha rhythms help bind it more deeply into memory. The therapeutic implications of this are vast. People struggling with anxiety, trauma, or overstimulation often show disrupted alpha activity. Their brains remain locked in high-frequency patterns that prevent rest, insight, and emotional regulation. Reintroducing silence, true, undisturbed, intentional silence, can begin to reverse this. It gives the brain the signal that it is safe again, that it no longer needs to brace itself against a flood of stimuli, that it can return to balance, to a rhythm that supports healing rather than defense. But alpha waves don't only serve the brain, they affect the entire body. When the mind is in a relaxed alpha state, breathing slows, muscles unclench, heart rate decreases, digestion improves. The parasympathetic nervous system becomes more active, guiding the body into a restorative mode. The body listens to the brain's rhythm. When the brain settles, the body follows. And while alpha waves may seem like a subtle phenomenon, their effects ripple through every aspect of consciousness. They do not shout, they do not force. They simply guide the mind gently inward, making space for reflection, creativity, memory, and emotional clarity. They are the rhythm of stillness, and silence is their perfect home. In moments of true silence, we begin to notice this rhythm, not as a sound, but as a feeling, a sense that the mind is floating, unburdened, yet awake, that we are both here and elsewhere, that there is more to thought than words, more to presence than effort. In this space, alpha waves hum quietly in the background, like the soft current beneath still water, moving everything without being seen. Long before the modern world filled itself with screens, cities, and constant conversation, there were traditions that understood the value of silence, not as absence, but as a presence. In nearly every ancient culture and spiritual lineage, silence has been held as something sacred. It was not merely a gap between words, but a doorway into something deeper, something eternal, something that cannot be captured by language. The practice of inner stillness, of retreating from the noise of the world and the chatter of the mind, has been revered as a path toward wisdom, healing, and transcendence. Monks in distant mountain monasteries, mystics in deserts, hermits in forests, yogis in caves, all of them, across centuries and continents, chose silence as their companion. Not because they feared sound, but because they recognized the noise of the external world as a veil that clouds the clarity of inner truth. When they entered silence, they were not abandoning the world. They were listening more deeply to it, tuning in to a frequency that is always present but rarely heard. Inner stillness is not something that needs to be created. It already exists, like the stillness at the bottom of the ocean. What silence does is clear away the surface turbulence, allowing us to sink into that deeper awareness. In this space, something ancient awakens in the mind. It's not a thought, but a recognition, a remembering, as if some forgotten part of the self has been patiently waiting beneath all the noise and doing and striving, waiting for you to be quiet enough to hear it breathe. These traditions taught that the mind, left unexamined, is like a restless monkey, jumping from branch to branch, reacting, craving, fearing, imagining. Silence doesn't stop the monkey, but it slows it. It allows us to see its patterns, to see the thoughts not as facts, but as passing clouds. Inner stillness is the practice of not grabbing onto those clouds, not resisting them, not judging them, simply letting them float by. In this state, a gap opens up between the thought and the thinker, and in that gap, a profound freedom begins to emerge. The ancient practices of contemplation, meditation, and prayer were not designed to escape reality. They were designed to reveal it. The reality beneath roles, beneath routines, beneath assumptions. And all of them begin in silence, in the pause between breaths, in the gentle return to the moment. This return doesn't need to be dramatic. It doesn't need incense or chanting or retreat centers. It can happen in your room, with your eyes closed and your phone turned off. It can happen while watching a candle flicker, or feeling the weight of your body in a chair, or listening to the sound of your own heartbeat. The inner stillness awakened by silence is not fragile. It may feel soft, but it is strong. It is the foundation of true resilience. When we are connected to that still place within, we are less shaken by the world's chaos. We can respond instead of react. We can see others more clearly without projection or urgency. We can hear what is really being said, not just the noise of someone's words. We can choose our direction with intention, rather than being swept up in momentum. This is the quiet power that comes from regular contact with silence, not a withdrawal, but a kind of deep readiness, a stability that isn't loud, but unshakable. And silence doesn't just connect us to ourselves, it connects us to others in more meaningful ways. In many spiritual traditions, there is a belief that true connection between humans, between the self and the divine, can only happen when words fall away. In the silent gaze between two people, in the shared stillness of a sunrise, in the moments where nothing needs to be said, and yet everything is understood. In silence, we are no longer defined by what we say, what we do, or what we achieve. We are simply present, and that presence is enough. Silence also opens a space for humility. It shows us how much we do not know and how much we don't need to know in order to be at peace. It reveals the limits of language, the inadequacy of explanation, the comfort of not having to perform, explain, justify, or impress. In silence, we return to a more essential version of ourselves, before the masks, before the identities, before the roles we play. And in that return, we find not emptiness, but depth. The inner stillness that arises in silence does not seek attention. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand. It just waits, quietly, patiently, always available. And the more we visit it, the more familiar it becomes. At first, it may feel strange or even uncomfortable. The mind may rebel, filling the silence with noise. But if we stay, if we soften into the quiet, the resistance begins to melt. What's left is something pure and grounding. A silence that is not silent at all, but alive. A silence that listens back. A silence that knows. Throughout time, people have sought out silence not just as a way to rest, but as a way to transform. At the heart of this transformation lies a practice that spans centuries, cultures, and religions: the cultivation of the quiet mind. In monastic traditions, silence is not simply a discipline. It is a portal to something deeper. It is through silence that monks and contemplatives enter a relationship with themselves, with the divine, and with reality in its purest, most unfiltered form. And this practice of quieting the mind, of softening the inner noise, is not reserved for those in robes or secluded mountain temples. It is available to anyone willing to sit with the silence long enough to feel what lies beneath the surface of thought. In a monastery, silence is woven into the rhythm of daily life. It is not always absolute or total, but it is honored. Meals are eaten in silence. Work is performed in silence. Long hours are set aside for prayer or meditation in silence. This isn't because silence is more virtuous than speech, but because silence helps the mind find its natural resting place. Monks understand something that science is only now beginning to affirm: that silence doesn't suppress the mind, it reveals it. When the noise fades, the chatter quiets, and the compulsion to speak dissolves. The deeper layers of consciousness begin to emerge. The mind, when left unchecked, tends to spin. It plans, it analyzes, it anticipates, it judges. Even when the body is still, the mind keeps moving, leaping from one thought to the next, trying to make sense of everything, trying to prepare for every possibility. This movement is not wrong. It's part of how we survive, how we learn, how we engage with the world. But it becomes exhausting when it's constant. The untrained mind behaves like a restless animal, always searching, always evaluating, always on guard. Silence invites that animal to lie down, to trust, to let go. In monastic silence, the goal is not to stop thinking altogether, but to stop clinging to thought, to witness thoughts as they arise without judgment or attachment, and to let them pass like clouds in a vast sky. This practice doesn't require belief. It requires only patience, discipline, and a willingness to remain present with whatever arises. Over time, as the silence deepens, the mind begins to find a different quality of awareness, one that is slower, more spacious, and less reactive. There is less identification with every passing emotion, less need to control or explain every thought. A new center begins to emerge, one that isn't based on the constant construction of identity, but on quiet presence. Monks describe this presence in many ways: as clarity, as surrender, as union with the divine. In secular terms, we might call it integration, coherence, a deep alignment between the mind, the body, and the breath. In this state, attention becomes steady and luminous. Even the most ordinary moments, a drop of water, a flicker of candlelight, the sensation of breath entering the nostrils, are experienced as sacred. There's a quality of reverence that arises, not because of any dogma or belief, but because the mind is finally quiet enough to see clearly, to feel fully, to recognize the mystery that is always present, yet so often drowned out by noise. The brain, in these quiet states, shows a very specific kind of activity. It shifts away from high-frequency, task-driven waves and into slower, more meditative rhythms. Neural networks that were overactive begin to settle. The nervous system moves out of the stress response and into parasympathetic rest. Cortisol levels decrease. Heart rate variability improves. The immune system becomes more balanced. And all of this happens not through intervention, not through stimulation, but through the gentle act of non-doing, through being still, through being silent, through being present. In this space, monks often report moments of deep insight, not because they are seeking it, but because silence allows it to rise on its own. When the mind is no longer trying to control or manufacture understanding, true understanding appears. This isn't intellectual understanding, but something more intuitive, a knowing that bypasses language, a kind of inner seeing, and it often comes not with fanfare, but with stillness, the soft realization that things are already okay, that nothing needs to be added, that reality, as it is enough. Monastic silence also teaches endurance. It teaches how to sit with discomfort without needing to fix it. It shows us that boredom is not something to be avoided, but something to be entered. That behind the boredom is often grief, and behind the grief, often beauty. Silence peels back the layers. It shows us what we're made of. It doesn't flatter or entertain. It holds up a mirror. And if we are willing to look, we may see ourselves more clearly than we ever have. This is why silence is often feared, because it reveals. It reveals the places we've avoided, the parts of us that are still hurting, the truths we've buried under distraction. But it also offers healing, not by solving our problems, but by allowing us to be with them in a new way. A way that isn't rushed or resisted. A way that is patient, open, compassionate. In silence, the heart softens, the mind opens, the soul exhales. You don't need to live in a monastery to taste this. You don't need to leave your life behind. All it takes is a few minutes of sincere stillness, a decision to stop reaching outward and instead listen inward. A willingness to experience what is, without immediately trying to change it. And in that willingness, the practice begins, not as something grand or perfect, but as a simple return to the self, a return to the breath, to the body, to the still point within, a point that, once found, becomes the anchor for everything else. In recent years, neuroscience has begun to confirm something that ancient mystics and contemplatives understood intuitively, that quiet spaces are not just spiritually nourishing, but biologically necessary. When we remove ourselves from the flood of stimulation, visual, auditory, emotional, the brain begins to behave differently. The systems that are constantly activated by tasks and distractions begin to quiet down. New patterns emerge. different regions light up. And among these regions, some of the most interesting activity is found in what's called the default mode network. The default mode network, or DMN, is a constellation of brain regions that activate when the mind is at rest and not focused on the outside world. This network becomes especially active during quiet reflection, daydreaming, self-inquiry, and periods of silence. And while it was once believed that the DMN was merely background noise, something passive and unimportant, we now know that it plays a central role in our sense of self, in our ability to imagine the future, and in how we integrate memory and meaning into our lives. What neuroscience has revealed about quiet spaces is that they act as a switch, flipping the brain out of the external attention system, which governs tasks, goals, and problem solving, and into the internal attention system, governed largely by the DMN. This transition doesn't just change what we think about, it changes how we think. In a quiet space, especially one free from social or technological noise, the brain stops bracing for the next stimulus. It opens. It begins to scan inward rather than outward. And in that inward scanning, a different kind of intelligence emerges. This inward intelligence is reflective, creative, emotional, and self-aware. It doesn't rush towards conclusions. It allows ideas to rise slowly, to unfold, to connect across time and experience. Quiet spaces support this process by reducing what neuroscientists call cognitive load, the amount of mental effort required to process what's going on around us. When we step into silence, the demands on our sensory and cognitive systems decrease. And in that decrease, the brain recovers energy. It reallocates that energy toward long-term planning, deeper emotional understanding, and even spiritual or philosophical insight. What's fascinating is that this shift toward internal awareness also strengthens empathy. Studies using functional MRI have shown that when the brain is in a quiet, reflective state, the same regions that are used for thinking about ourselves are used for thinking about others. In other words, when we spend time in silence, we not only reflect on our own lives, we also become more capable of imagining what others feel. Quiet spaces make us more human, more connected, more able to listen, not just to ourselves, but to the world. Silence also allows the nervous system to reset its baseline. In loud, overstimulated environments, the brain becomes hypersensitive. It begins to interpret neutral events as stressful. It anticipates threat, even when there is none. But in a calm, quiet setting, the nervous system gradually recalibrates. Heart rate lowers. Breath deepens. Muscles unclench. The parasympathetic nervous system, responsible for rest, digestion, and healing, becomes dominant. And as this shift occurs, the brain begins to repair itself. It processes information more accurately. It regulates emotion more effectively. It stops bracing against life and starts receiving it. The architectural design of quiet also plays a role. Spaces that are acoustically soft with natural materials and gentle light create the conditions for silence to deepen. In these environments, sound is absorbed rather than bounced back. The air feels thicker, more grounded. The mind feels protected, cradled. Monasteries, ancient temples, and sacred caves all share this quality. They were not built for entertainment. They were built to hold silence. And that silence, in turn, holds the mind. Even in modern environments, we can create microspaces of quiet. A corner of a room, a shaded place under a tree, a short walk at dawn. These moments don't have to be dramatic to be effective. The brain responds quickly to even brief periods of reduced input. A few minutes of intentional silence can reset attention. It can lower stress hormones. It can shift mood. It can open space for insight. Over time, these moments accumulate, rewiring the brain towards stability rather than reactivity. The implications of this are profound. In a world increasingly filled with artificial stimulation, quiet spaces become not just comforting, but essential. They are not a retreat from life, but a return to its essence. In silence, we hear ourselves more clearly. We remember what matters. We feel the rhythm of our own breath, the pulse of the earth beneath us, the subtle voice of intuition that speaks only when everything else grows still. And in these quiet spaces, the brain is no longer just reacting, it is reflecting, integrating, renewing. It becomes not a processor of data, but a vessel of awareness, not a machine, but a mind. There is a kind of emotional healing that can only take place in the absence of distraction. When the mind is no longer pulled outward by noise, it begins to turn inward toward the places it has been avoiding. Beneath the surface of our daily awareness live thoughts we haven't processed, feelings we've brushed aside, and wounds we haven't had the space or the courage to face. Silence brings these things into the light, not abruptly, not with force, but gently, like the slow rising of the sun over a landscape that's been hidden in shadow. In everyday life, emotions come and go in fragments. A feeling might arise during a conversation, a song, a memory. But before it can be understood, we've already moved on to the next thing. The world does not wait for us to feel deeply. It rushes forward, offering more input, more demands, more distraction. And so, emotions accumulate. They pile up in the background of our minds, half felt and half understood, quietly shaping our moods, our energy, and our choices. This emotional backlog is heavy, though we often don't realize we're carrying it until we enter a moment of quiet. In silence, the backlog begins to move. The mind no longer has excuses to avoid. There is no one to impress, no screen to scroll, no task to complete. The distractions fall away, and what's left is the truth, sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes overwhelming, sometimes beautiful. Old sadness may rise, forgotten fears may bubble up, but so too may joy, peace, or clarity that had been buried underneath the noise of survival. These emotions don't appear to torment us. They appear to be acknowledged, to be felt all the way through, and to finally complete their arc. This is the secret strength of silence. It provides the container for emotional completion. When an emotion is given space, when we allow it to speak without interruption, to move through the body without resistance, it resolves itself. The body knows how to cry. The heart knows how to release. The nervous system knows how to calm once a storm has passed. But none of this can happen when we keep ourselves constantly busy, constantly distracted, constantly filled with noise. In therapeutic settings, some of the most profound breakthroughs occur not in words, but in silence. A long pause after a question. A quiet moment when no one speaks. These silences are not empty. They are full of presence, of truth, of vulnerability. They allow what is unspoken to rise. They allow the client's inner world to take shape. In this same way, when we sit alone in silence, we become our own witness. We sit with ourselves the way a good therapist might, not judging, not fixing, just being there. And that presence alone begins to heal. The physiological mechanisms behind this are just as compelling. When we allow ourselves to feel deeply in silence, the body activates the parasympathetic nervous system. This is the system responsible for rest, digestion, and restoration. It slows the heart rate. It deepens the breath. It allows the muscles to relax. These are not just signs of peace. They are the conditions required for emotional processing. When the body feels safe, the mind feels safe. And when the mind feels safe, it is more willing to open the vault of unprocessed feelings. In this state, the brain is not analyzing emotions, but integrating them. The limbic system, which handles emotional processing, communicates more freely with the prefrontal cortex, which governs meaning-making and self-awareness. Together, they form a bridge between feeling and understanding. This is where insight arises. Not just, I feel sad, but I understand where this sadness comes from. Not just, I'm angry, but I see what this anger is protecting. Silence allows these realizations to surface, not as thoughts we chase, but as truths we uncover. And while some emotions may be intense, silence does not amplify them to harm us. It simply reveals what has already been there. The emotions waiting in silence are not new. They are old passengers who have been riding in the back seat, quietly influencing the journey. When we turn toward them in stillness, we finally give them a voice. We finally let them rest. And when they rest, something else can emerge in their place. Lightness, openness, even joy. This process can be deeply personal. Everyone's silence is different. For some, it's gentle. For others, it's turbulent. But in every case, silence tells the truth. It tells you what you're ready to hear, what you're ready to feel. It doesn't push, but it doesn't lie. It holds a mirror up to your inner world and waits patiently for you to look. And the longer you sit with it, the clearer the reflection becomes. What's often surprising is that after the emotional waves pass, silence becomes a source of comfort. It no longer feels empty, it feels like home. The same space that once seemed intimidating becomes the place where peace lives. Not a peace built on avoidance or control, but a peace built on integration. A peace that comes from knowing you faced yourself and survived. From knowing that nothing inside you is too much to bear when met with quiet attention. From realizing that healing doesn't always come in the form of words, but in the soft, patient unfolding that silence allows. Solitude and silence are often misunderstood in the modern world. We tend to associate them with loneliness or isolation, as though being alone with ourselves is something to avoid or fix. But in truth, silence in solitude offers one of the most powerful forms of emotional nourishment we can experience. It is in these moments, when no one is watching and no one is speaking, that we discover what we are really made of. Not the roles we play, not the identities we project, but the quiet essence that lives beneath it all. In solitude, silence becomes a companion, not an absence. And when we allow ourselves to sit with that companion, something profound begins to unfold. The experience of solitude allows us to drop the masks we wear for others. Even in loving relationships, even in friendships built on trust, We often carry subtle layers of performance. We adjust our tone, we shape our words, we anticipate how we'll be received. These adaptations are natural, even necessary in social life, but they are also exhausting. They keep a part of our attention pointed outward, constantly gauging, reacting, calibrating. In solitude, all of that falls away. The need to be anyone dissolves. You are no longer someone's child or partner or friend or colleague. You are simply awareness, resting in itself. When you pair solitude with silence, this awareness begins to deepen. The mind, no longer interrupted by conversation or devices, starts to notice itself. It begins to hear the quieter thoughts, those that don't scream for attention, those that whisper underneath the surface. These thoughts are often more honest. They're not filtered through social expectation. They don't need to prove anything, and they reveal truths that we may not have been able to face in busier moments. How we truly feel about something, what we've been avoiding, what we truly need. This is not always easy, but it is real, and there is freedom in that realness. Solitude in silence also changes our relationship with time. When we are alone and quiet, the clock seems to slow. There is no rush to the next thing, no mental list ticking forward. Time becomes less of a schedule and more of a space in which we can breathe, think, reflect, or simply be. This spaciousness is not empty. It is filled with presence, a kind of luminous stillness that holds you gently, reminding you that you do not have to constantly perform to exist. You do not have to achieve, entertain, or explain. You are allowed to simply be. In this state, the nervous system begins to reset. Cortisol levels drop. The breath deepens. The heart rate steadies. Without the subtle tension that often accompanies social interaction, the body softens. Muscles unclench. The face relaxes. Even the eyes rest differently when we are alone and not taking in information from screens or books. It's as if the body finally knows it's safe. And in that safety, something beautiful begins to rise. Not excitement, not productivity, but a quiet contentment. A fullness that does not come from stimulation, but from presence. Spending time in solitude and silence also gives us a rare chance to develop self-trust. When we are constantly surrounded by others, whether physically or digitally, we are influenced by their perspectives, opinions, and emotional states. That's not inherently bad, but it can make it harder to hear our own voice. In silence, that voice has room to speak, and at first, it may be faint. It may be tangled with old beliefs or fears. But the more we listen, the clearer it becomes. We start to notice what actually feels true to us, not what we've been told should feel true. We begin to navigate life not from obligation, but from inner alignment. This kind of self-trust isn't built on affirmations or achievements. It's built in quiet moments when we choose to stay with ourselves rather than escape. It's built when we face discomfort without numbing, when we sit in uncertainty without reaching for distraction. It's in those moments that we learn, I can hold this, I can stay with this, I don't need to run. And from that learning comes resilience, not a brittle strength, but a supple, grounded kind of strength that grows quietly and steadily over time. Silence and solitude also rekindles our sense of wonder. Without the constant stream of content, opinions, and curated images, we begin to see the world through fresh eyes. A shadow on the wall, the sound of the wind, the feeling of the sun on skin. These things, so easily missed, become vivid again. Not because they've changed, but because we've slowed down enough to notice. And in that noticing, we remember what it means to be alive. Not in the sense of doing, but in the sense of experiencing, of inhabiting a moment fully, without need or agenda. This is why many artists, writers, and thinkers retreat into solitude when they are seeking clarity or inspiration. They know that it's not the absence of noise that creates insight. It's the presence of space. A space where something new can arise, unshaped by outside pressure. That space doesn't just birth ideas. It births parts of ourselves that we haven't yet met. It allows us to touch the parts that are shy or scared, or deeply wise. It invites us to meet our own soul without interruption. And while modern life makes solitude rare, it does not make it inaccessible. We can claim it in small ways, in the early hours before others wake, in a walk without a phone, in moments between tasks when we pause and breathe. We can cultivate it not by escaping life, but by choosing, moment by moment, to turn toward ourselves, to sit in the quiet, to listen, to remember that silence is not a void, but a sanctuary, one we carry with us always, whether we step into it or not. In the presence of silence, something ancient begins to stir. It is not a thought or a memory, not a plan or a desire, but a deep sense of connection, one that doesn't require language or explanation. It arises from within, but extends beyond the self. It's a feeling of being held by something larger, something invisible, something profoundly alive. In this stillness, the soul begins to recognize itself, not as a concept, not as an identity, but as a subtle awareness that has always been there, just beneath the surface of sound and form. And in this recognition, we begin to remember what we are made of. Not flesh and thought alone, but presence, attention, and something that borders on the sacred. When we enter a moment of true quiet, especially when it stretches beyond a few minutes, our usual modes of perception begin to soften. The inner commentator, the voice narrating every moment, begins to lose its grip. We stop thinking in sentences. We begin to sense in waves, feel in colors, perceive in silences. The boundaries between the self and the world loosen. What once felt separate begins to feel shared. The breath you take feels connected to the wind outside. The warmth in your chest mirrors the warmth of sunlight. The silence inside you echoes the silence around you. And in this echo, something opens. This opening is what many spiritual traditions have described as communion, not in the ritual sense, but in the raw, lived sense. A merging between self and something greater. Some call it the divine. Others call it nature, truth, stillness, or simply being. Whatever the name, the experience is the same. A sudden, quiet realization that you are not alone, that you are not separate, that behind the veil of your thoughts and worries, there is a vast field of calm, and it's been waiting for you to come home. This experience does not require belief. It does not require religion or doctrine. It simply requires space. And silence is that space. It's the temple without walls, the sanctuary without doors. It's the place where we remember, not with the mind, but with the heart. We remember that we belong, that we don't have to earn this moment, that we don't have to prove our worth to the universe. We are already part of it. We always were. In silence, our attention drops from the head into the body. We begin to feel the heartbeat not as a function, but as a drum. We hear the breath not as oxygen, but as song. The body becomes a listening instrument. And in that listening, the soul speaks, not in words, but in sensations, images, intuitions. It tells us what we've ignored. It reminds us of what we love. It shows us where we're clinging and where we're ready to let go. These messages don't arrive like commands. They arrive like whispers, like the soft touch of a hand on the shoulder in a dream. This is why silence has always been the birthplace of transformation. It allows us to dissolve, not in a way that loses the self, but in a way that softens it. The tight edges of our identity begin to blur. The I that is constantly trying to manage, defend, and define begins to rest. And in its resting, the soul rises, not as something new, but as something we had forgotten we were. A presence that watches, that knows, that loves without reason. A presence that feels ancient and eternal at the same time. There is a paradox here, that the more we let go of trying to find ourselves, the more we begin to see who we are. And this seeing comes not through effort, but through stillness, through surrender, through the willingness to sit in the silence long enough for the masks to fall away. In that falling, something deeper is revealed. A tenderness that has no armor, a wisdom that has no agenda, a knowing that is quiet, certain, and free. The soul does not shout, it does not demand, it does not argue, it waits. It waits beneath the noise, beneath the distractions, beneath the stories. It waits for a moment of silence, for a breath of stillness, to rise like mist over a calm lake. And when it rises, we feel something shift. We may not know what to call it. We may not be able to explain it, but we know it's real. It feels like coming home to a part of ourselves that never left, even when we stopped listening. This is not a dramatic awakening. It's subtle. It's slow. It's gentle. It happens not in great flashes of revelation, but in quiet recognitions. When we sit alone in a room and realize we are not lonely, just present. When we walk beneath the trees and feel them listening. When we close our eyes and sense a presence that asks nothing of us, yet loves us anyway. In these moments, silence becomes sacred, not because it was granted from above, but because we finally made space for it to be revealed. And the more time we spend in this kind of silence, the more it begins to change us, not by adding to us, but by stripping away what no longer serves. The fears that kept us running, the identities we wore too tightly, the noise we mistook for truth, all of it begins to fall away, not with force, but with grace. And what's left is not emptiness, it's fullness, a fullness that doesn't need to be filled because it is the source. In this fullness, we find guidance, not the kind that tells us exactly what to do, but the kind that gently points us toward our deeper path. A sense of alignment, of inner harmony, of moving in rhythm with something much older than our minds. It doesn't always make sense to logic, but it feels right. It feels like truth without argument, direction without pressure, wisdom without weight. And we begin to trust that feeling, to follow it, to return to silence not just for comfort, but for communion, for clarity, for the quiet joy of remembering again and again who we really are. In the natural world, silence is not the absence of life, but the pulse of it. It is in the quietest forests, the stillest deserts, the calmest stretches of sea, where the deepest energies reside. When we step into nature's quiet, we are not stepping into nothingness. We are entering into relationship. A relationship that speaks without words, listens without expectation, and heals without effort. Nature's silence is alive. It breathes. And when we listen closely, we begin to hear not just the absence of human noise, but the presence of something far more ancient, more grounded, more whole. The brain responds almost instantly to this kind of silence. In a forest, even when birds are quiet and wind is still, the environment holds a kind of acoustic spaciousness that allows the nervous system to exhale. This is not just poetic. Studies have shown that natural silence, what researchers sometimes call baseline environmental quiet, lowers heart rate, reduces blood pressure, and rebalances brainwave activity. Alpha and theta waves rise, stress markers decrease, and the default mode network becomes more active, offering us a sense of deep introspection and emotional clarity. Nature, in her silence, coaxes the mind back into coherence. This coherence is not just a feeling, it is measurable. People who spend even a short time in natural silence report increased focus, emotional balance, and a sense of psychological restoration. The Japanese practice of Shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing, was developed out of this understanding that immersing oneself in the stillness of trees can reduce anxiety, improve immune function, and lift the fog of overstimulated modern life. But what these studies are only beginning to uncover is what the human heart has known for thousands of years, that nature's silence is not passive, it is medicinal. There is a reason why so many sacred texts were written in wilderness, why prophets and mystics withdrew to deserts and mountains to find clarity. It is not because nature was merely a backdrop. It is because in nature, human noise falls away and the soul begins to listen to something older than speech, the rustle of leaves, the rhythm of waves, the hush of snowfall. These sounds don't crowd the mind, they cradle it. They do not demand our attention, but they welcome it. And in that welcome, the ego begins to loosen its grip. In silence, we stop posturing, planning, and defending. We begin to receive. And the earth receives us in return, not with approval or applause, but with stillness. The stillness of a tree that has stood through centuries of storm. The stillness of rocks shaped by wind and water over millennia. This stillness has a presence, a weight, a kind of grounded intelligence that cannot be named, but can be felt. When we sit in this kind of silence long enough, we begin to absorb it. Our breath slows, our gaze softens, our inner monologue becomes quieter. We become more like the land itself, rooted, watchful, and vast. Even animals seem to recognize this shift. When a person enters nature with reverence, without speaking, without disturbing, they often encounter wild beings not in fear, but in curiosity. A deer pauses, unalarmed. A bird continues singing, undisturbed. The silence we bring is matched by theirs, and in this shared quiet, a mutual respect arises. We are no longer invaders. We are part of the landscape, This is what the indigenous peoples of the world have always understood, that to walk silently upon the land is to walk in harmony with it, to honor its spirit, to live as a guest, not a master. Nature's silence also helps us access a different kind of time. In cities, time moves quickly, measured in minutes, traffic lights, deadlines, and alerts. But in a silent grove, time expands. It unfolds in circles, not lines. You begin to feel it in seasons, in shadows, in the way light filters through leaves. This slower rhythm is not just restful, it recalibrates our entire sense of presence. We stop rushing toward the next thing. We begin to notice where we are, and in that noticing, we become more alive. The textures of silence in nature are layered. There is the broad silence of a wide open field, the muffled silence of falling snow, the echoing silence of a canyon. Each one speaks to a different part of the soul. Some evoke wonder, others grief. Some open the heart, others steady the mind. But all of them share a common trait. They bring us back to our senses, not just sight and sound, but intuition, instinct, insight. In silence, we don't just observe nature, we feel it. The moss underfoot, the scent of damp soil, the cool of shaded air, all of it enters us more fully because there is no noise to dilute it. And perhaps most beautifully, in the quiet of nature, we remember that we are not apart from the earth. We are expressions of it. Our bodies made from the minerals of the soil, our breath borrowed from the trees, our blood echoing the salt of the sea. Nature's silence reminds us not only of the world's beauty, but of our place in it. It strips away the illusion of separateness. It reveals a belonging that is not earned, but innate. A belonging that was never lost, only forgotten beneath layers of distraction and disconnection. This is why time in natural silence is not just restorative, it is sacred. It returns us to a kind of original innocence, a way of seeing without expectation, a way of being without striving. And in that return, something ancient inside of us begins to awaken, not a thought, not an identity, but a presence. A presence that listens to the forest, to the wind, to the sky, and feels that it is not listening to something outside, but to itself. In a world where speed is idolized and output is praised above all else, the brain is constantly being pushed beyond its natural rhythm. We are encouraged to stay connected, stay productive, stay informed. There's always another task to complete, another message to answer, another piece of information to process. This relentless drive toward doing leaves very little space for being. And over time, that imbalance takes a toll, not just on the body, but on the brain itself. The systems that are meant to cycle between activation and recovery get stuck in overdrive. The mind becomes a machine that never shuts down. Focus shatters, memory weakens, anxiety builds, and a quiet sense of disconnection settles in. It's in this overstimulated, overwhelmed state that the need to unplug becomes not just beneficial, but vital. Unplugging isn't just about turning off devices. It's about stepping out of the cycle of constant stimulation. It's about creating a pause, a gap, a breath between one demand and the next. And silence is the most potent form of unplugging. When we remove ourselves from the stream of digital noise and enter into silence, the brain begins to shift, not just metaphorically, but neurologically. The sympathetic nervous system, responsible for our fight or flight response, begins to deactivate. The parasympathetic system takes its place, inviting rest, digestion, healing. In this state, the brain no longer braces against the next alert. It no longer searches for meaning in constant updates. It begins to return to its original pace, a slower, steadier rhythm that supports clarity instead of confusion. Constant connectivity fragments our attention. The more inputs we try to process, the more our brain has to divide its resources. And while the mind can switch rapidly between tasks, it pays a price for every switch. There is a cognitive cost, tiny at first, but cumulative over time. The result is mental fatigue that feels subtle but persistent, a sense of being drained even when we've done little, a feeling of restlessness even when we're sitting still. This is the residue of overstimulation, and it doesn't go away with more content. It dissolves only in silence. Silence gives the brain something it rarely receives, a chance to complete its cycles. Thoughts that were interrupted by notifications get to finish. Emotions that were paused midstream get to move. The default mode network becomes active, allowing for internal integration, self-reflection, and long-term memory formation. In silence, the brain is no longer reacting. It is reorganizing, reconnecting, restoring. This restoration is especially important for the prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain responsible for executive function, planning, decision-making, impulse control, and emotional regulation. When overstimulated, the prefrontal cortex becomes depleted. We find it harder to focus, harder to resist distraction, harder to stay emotionally grounded. But in silence, this area is given space to recover. Brain imaging studies have shown that after periods of intentional quiet, activity in the prefrontal cortex becomes more balanced and efficient. We're not only more rested, we're more capable of thinking clearly and acting wisely. But beyond these physiological effects, there's something else that happens when we unplug and enter silence. We begin to remember what we've been ignoring. Not the missed emails or unread messages, but the deeper things, the thoughts we've been pushing away, the feelings we've been numbing, the truths we've been afraid to confront. When we're constantly stimulated, it's easy to stay on the surface, but silence has a way of pulling us inward, gently but persistently. It reveals the places within us that are tired or unresolved or simply hungry for attention. This confrontation with ourselves can be uncomfortable. At first, unplugging may feel more like deprivation than freedom. The absence of stimulation can create a sense of emptiness, even anxiety. But if we stay with it, something begins to shift. That emptiness becomes space. That space becomes presence. And in that presence, we start to find a different kind of nourishment, not from scrolling or watching or consuming, but from being, from reconnecting to the part of ourselves that isn't defined by activity, but by awareness. There is also something deeply humbling about being alone with one's own mind. Without noise to distract us, we come face to face with our inner climate. We notice the stories we repeat, the judgments we carry, the fears that linger just beneath the surface. This is not a problem, it is an invitation. An invitation to meet ourselves with honesty and compassion, to stop running from the uncomfortable parts, to recognize that silence does not make them louder, it makes them clearer. And in that clarity, we can begin to work with them, to soften them, to understand them, to heal them. Unplugging through silence also recalibrates our sense of scale. The constant input of digital life shrinks our focus. It narrows our attention to the size of a screen. But when we step into silence, especially in solitude, our awareness begins to expand. We start to see the bigger picture, not just of the world, but of our lives. What once felt urgent now feels optional. What once felt overwhelming now seems manageable. Silence shifts our perspective, not by changing the world, but by changing the lens through which we view it. This expanded awareness also reconnects us with time in a deeper way. Digital stimulation fragments time into moments of consumption, clicks, swipes, scrolls. But silence stretches time. It gives us the feeling of being immersed in the present, not racing through it. And in this immersion, we remember how to rest. Not the rest of sleep, but the rest of simply existing, of doing nothing and being everything, of feeling the breath move in and out without needing to control it, of hearing the quiet tick of a clock without wishing it would move faster. As this new relationship with time settles in, so does a gentler pace of being. We no longer feel the need to hurry through our own thoughts. We begin to listen more deeply, not just to others, but to ourselves. And that listening, over time, becomes a form of love. A love that says, you don't have to perform, you don't have to prove, you can simply be. This is the gift of unplugging through silence. Not just a break from the world, but a reconnection with the self. A reconnection that doesn't need technology, doesn't require a reason, and doesn't ask for anything in return. It simply waits, patiently, in the quiet. There is a forgotten intelligence that only reveals itself in silence. It's not the kind that rushes to solve problems or calculate outcomes. It's not driven by urgency, logic, or competition. It's an older, deeper kind of knowing, rooted not in the mind, but in the body, the heart, the breath. In silence, this intuitive intelligence begins to emerge, rising slowly like a mist from the forest floor, unhurried and formless, yet unmistakably present. It doesn't speak in language, but in feeling. It doesn't argue its case. It simply is, and when we pay attention, it guides us with a quiet certainty that no amount of analysis can match. In modern life, intuition is often overshadowed by information. We live in an age where nearly any question can be answered instantly. Data surrounds us, feeds us, and often overwhelms us. We're taught to trust what can be measured, cited, and proven. And while reason is a beautiful tool, it is not the only one. Beneath the surface of conscious thought, there is another form of perception, subtle, non-linear, and deeply personal. It doesn't offer certainty in the way facts do, but it offers resonance, a feeling that something is true or not, long before we can explain why. Silence allows this feeling to come forward. When the noise quiets, both outside and within, the internal compass becomes easier to feel. Not because it suddenly appears, but because it was never gone. It was only drowned out by the roar of distraction. When we remove the constant pressure to decide, to act, to respond, a space opens up. And in that space, something in us begins to lean toward truth. We feel drawn to certain choices, people, or places. We sense when something is off, even if we can't put it into words. And we begin to trust those feelings, not as guesses, but as guidance. This guidance doesn't come from nowhere. It's formed by experience, shaped by memory, and filtered through the body's own nervous system. The gut, for instance, contains over 500 million neurons, more than the spinal cord. It processes emotional and sensory information constantly, often faster than the brain. When we have a gut feeling, we are not imagining it. We are experiencing a form of embodied wisdom. But in order to hear it, we must be quiet enough to notice. Silence creates the conditions for this noticing. It slows down the thought loops. It softens the chatter. And in that softness, intuition becomes more than just a whisper. It becomes a steady rhythm we can follow. For many people, the first stirrings of intuition come in moments of stillness. A quiet walk alone, a sudden clarity while lying awake at night, an unexplainable peace while staring out a window. These are not coincidences. They are glimpses of the self beneath the surface. When the rational mind finally pauses, the deeper self can rise. And unlike the logical mind, the intuitive self doesn't need reasons. It knows what it knows in a way that cannot always be articulated. This knowing is often quieter than doubt, but stronger. It does not shout over fear. It waits patiently beneath it. Silence also allows us to feel the difference between fear and intuition. At first, they can be hard to tell apart. Both create strong sensations. Both ask us to listen. But fear is urgent, contracted, and rooted in survival. It says, act now or something bad will happen. Intuition is spacious, grounded, and timeless. It says, this way feels right, without the need for panic. Fear tightens the body. Intuition relaxes it. Fear narrows our focus. Intuition widens our view. Silence helps us notice these differences, not by analyzing them, but by experiencing them directly, again and again, until trust is built through familiarity. In fact, trust is the foundation of intuitive living, and trust cannot be rushed. It must be cultivated. Silence gives us the space to test and learn, to notice when we follow our inner nudges and something good unfolds, to reflect when we ignore them and feel misaligned. Over time, this process becomes more natural. We begin to live less from a place of calculation and more from a place of alignment, not recklessly, but responsively. We still use reason, but we balance it with inner knowing. We still gather information, but we no longer let it drown out the quiet voice inside. This way of being may not always be understood by others. Intuition doesn't always make logical sense. It might guide us to take a path that looks risky, or to leave something that appears fine on the surface. But those who learn to listen to their intuition understand something vital. That peace is the compass, not approval. That what feels true within carries more weight than what looks good from the outside. And that living in alignment with our inner guidance, even when it's uncomfortable, creates a deeper, more sustainable sense of clarity and fulfillment. There's also a mysterious aspect to intuition that often defies explanation. Sometimes it feels like a message arriving from somewhere beyond ourselves. A sudden insight, a dream that carries meaning, a sense of being gently pushed or protected. Silence opens us to these moments. It allows us to receive what can't be forced, what only appears when the mind is soft and the heart is open. And when these moments come, we feel something undeniable, that there's a current running beneath the surface of life, and we are capable of sensing it. To live intuitively is not to abandon thought. It is to place it in service of something deeper. It is to walk through life, not just with eyes and ears, but with a receptive heart. And it is in silence that this heart hears most clearly. It doesn't always bring immediate answers, but it always brings us closer to truth. Not the truth we inherit or imitate, but the one that rises from within, silent, steady, and unmistakably our own. Not all silence is the same. There is a difference between silence that is empty and silence that is full. Some silences feel hollow, like an absence of connection or a retreat into numbness. But others, the ones that arise from deep presence, are alive with meaning. These are the silences that don't isolate us from others, but draw us closer to them. The kind of silence that exists between two people who truly see each other, who no longer need to speak in order to feel known. This is the silence of connection. And though it has no words, it often speaks louder than language ever could. In a world that encourages constant expression, silence in relationships can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. We're taught to fill gaps in conversation, to avoid awkward pauses, to equate talking with intimacy. But true intimacy does not require constant communication. In fact, the deepest bonds often form in the quiet moments, when two people can simply be together without the need to entertain or explain. In these moments, presence becomes the message. A glance, a shared breath, a hand resting near another's. These small, quiet acts communicate safety, trust, and belonging in a way no words ever could. Think of the feeling you get sitting beside someone you love while watching a sunset, or lying next to a partner in bed at night, both of you awake, yet silent, or walking beside a friend in the woods, neither of you speaking, yet both of you feeling a wordless ease. These are not moments of absence. They are moments of fullness. The silence is not a gap. It is the connection itself, woven through awareness, mutual understanding, and shared presence. This kind of silence is especially important in close relationships. When we allow silence, we allow space for emotions to breathe, for thoughts to settle, for presence to deepen. We resist the urge to immediately respond, to fix, to fill. Instead, we offer each other the gift of our listening. Not the kind of listening that waits for its turn to speak, but the kind that opens, absorbs, and accepts. This kind of silence tells the other person, "You don't have to impress me. You don't have to rush. I'm here with you, as you are." In conflict, silence can be even more powerful. It can provide the space needed to calm before reacting, to feel instead of defend, to understand rather than win. When two people are hurt or overwhelmed, words can sometimes do more damage than good. In those moments, a pause, a long intentional silence, can prevent a spiral of misunderstanding. It gives both people time to breathe, to feel the heat in their bodies begin to cool, and to reconnect with the part of themselves that seeks peace rather than power. But silence in relationships isn't always easy. It can bring up vulnerability. It can highlight distance. It can make us wonder, are we disconnected or are we simply quiet? This is where discernment comes in. To sit in silence with another requires trust. Trust that the relationship is strong enough to hold space without constant confirmation. Trust that presence is enough, even without performance. And when that trust is there, silence becomes a bridge rather than a barrier. It becomes a sacred space where two people meet, not just through dialogue, but through being. It's worth noticing how we react to silence with others. Do we reach for our phones? Do we rush to fill the gap? Do we feel compelled to make a joke or offer reassurance? These impulses are not wrong, but they point to our conditioning, to the discomfort we may carry around stillness and vulnerability. By becoming aware of these habits, we can begin to change our relationship with silence. We can begin to view it not as something to fix, but as something to honor, as something that has the potential to deepen our relationships in ways that words alone cannot. Silence also reveals the emotional tone beneath conversations. When we stop talking, we become more sensitive to nonverbal cues, the way someone's shoulders shift, the rhythm of their breath, the softness or tension in their gaze. These details hold information. They speak of fear, joy, fatigue, longing, and when we tune into them without trying to control or interpret, we create a kind of emotional intimacy that is rare and precious. It says, "I see you not just for what you say, but for what you feel." This kind of attuned silence builds empathy. It invites us to listen with more than our ears. It teaches us patience, and it reminds us that real connection isn't about constant stimulation. It's about shared presence. Two nervous systems regulating each other, not through conversation, but through calm. Two hearts recognizing each other in the space between words. In long-term relationships, silence can take on a rhythm of its own. It becomes familiar, like the quiet of a home you know by heart. It no longer feels empty, it feels safe. It allows each person to retreat inward without feeling alone. And in those retreats, the bond strengthens, not weakens. Because when someone can be silent around you and still feel connected, they feel truly free. Free to be without performance. Free to rest without guilt. Free to simply exist alongside you in peace. And so, in both new and old relationships, silence becomes a kind of shared language. One that says, "I trust you. I don't need you to fill the space. I want your presence, not your perfection." It becomes a soft, invisible thread that weaves people closer, not by what they say, but by what they're willing to hold together in stillness. Creativity does not thrive in chaos. It needs space, quiet, and room to breathe. Though we often associate creativity with bursts of inspiration or the fast-paced rush of ideas, its true origin lies deeper, in a place of stillness. Silence provides the soil in which creative thoughts take root. It gives the mind the freedom to wander without agenda, to explore without interruption, to drift gently across memories, emotions, images, and insights. When the noise of the outside world quiets, the inner world begins to speak, and it speaks in symbols, visions, connections, and metaphors. This is the secret language of creativity, and it is most audible in the absence of distraction. When we're constantly engaged, scrolling, talking, responding, reacting, the brain operates in what is known as task-positive mode. This state is efficient, focused, goal-oriented. It helps us manage our responsibilities, solve problems, and complete to-do lists. But creativity doesn't live here. Creativity blooms in the opposite state, the default mode network. This is the brain's relaxed, inward-turning circuit that activates when we are daydreaming, resting, or reflecting. It's the space between thoughts, the pause between tasks, the silence after a conversation ends. And it is precisely this state that silence nurtures. In silence, the mind begins to roam freely. It drifts backward into memory, forward into imagination. It loops through unresolved feelings and half-finished thoughts. It stumbles upon fragments of dreams, forgotten stories, unexpected questions. And in these loose, unstructured wanderings, something magical happens. Patterns begin to form. Connections spark. An idea from childhood meets a conversation from yesterday and suddenly forms a new path. A single word heard years ago resurfaces in the stillness and opens the door to a story, a poem, a melody, a painting. This is not the result of effort. It is the natural rhythm of the quiet mind. Artists, writers, musicians, and thinkers throughout history have spoken of this, that their best ideas often came not during the act of creation, but in the moments between. During a walk in the woods, while lying awake in the early morning, sitting alone by a window, staring into space. These moments are not wasted. They are fertile. They allow the subconscious mind to sift and combine ideas in ways the conscious mind cannot plan. They allow space for surprise, which is the heartbeat of all creativity. And it's not just artists who benefit. Everyone has a creative mind. Whether it's solving problems, building relationships, imagining futures, or making meaning from experience. Creativity is how we navigate life itself, but it can only emerge fully when there is enough silence for it to stretch. Otherwise, our thoughts remain trapped in the grooves of habit and noise. We repeat the same ideas, reach for the same answers, live within the same constraints. Silence breaks those patterns. It invites the new, the uncertain, the alive. There's something else that silence does for creativity. It removes the fear of judgment. When we are constantly surrounded by noise, we are also surrounded by comparison. The voices of others, the images of success, the metrics of worth. They crowd the mind and stifle the spirit. But in silence, those voices fade. And what rises instead is the whisper of your own voice. Not the one shaped by expectation, but the one shaped by curiosity. The voice that says, "What if?" instead of, "Is this good enough?" This voice is playful, exploratory, and open. It leads you not to perfection, but to discovery. Silence also helps us slow down, and in slowness, we begin to notice what we often miss. The subtle texture of a thought, the nuance of a color, the rhythm of a sentence as it forms in the mind. In silence, we become better observers of ourselves, of the world, of the mystery unfolding between the two. This kind of attention is not passive, it's radiant. It lights up the ordinary and reveals its hidden beauty. And from that beauty, new ideas begin to form, as if the silence itself were feeding them into us. Even boredom, when embraced in silence, becomes a doorway. What begins as restlessness often transforms into invention. The mind, starved of input, begins to generate its own. It creates stories, questions, games, and solutions. It becomes a generator, not just a receiver. This is one of the greatest gifts of silence. It returns the mind to its original creativity, the kind we had as children, before we were taught to fear mistakes or seek approval. The kind of creativity that doesn't ask if it's useful, it simply is. And as we spend more time in silence, creativity stops being an occasional spark and starts becoming a way of moving through the world. We begin to live creatively, not just through art or work, but through perception itself. We notice more, feel more, imagine more. We become open to possibility, to uncertainty, to wonder. Life itself begins to feel more like a canvas, less like a checklist. And in this space, we rediscover a deeper joy, not in what we produce, but in what we sense. In a society that values constant output, choosing silence may seem counterintuitive. But for the creative mind, silence is not a retreat. It's a return to the place where ideas are born, where insight waits patiently to be seen, where the mind is free to meander without aim and still arrive somewhere unexpected. It is in silence that we remember we are not just consumers of ideas. We are creators, not just thinkers, but feelers, dreamers, visionaries. And in the quiet, all the forgotten parts of the imagination begin to wake again. In the stillness of silence, the brain begins to unravel the tangled threads of emotion and thought that often bind us in cycles of confusion and overwhelm. This unraveling is a delicate process, one that requires patience, presence, and above all, quiet. When the external world grows loud and fast, our internal world mirrors that chaos. Thoughts race, feelings surge, and the mind jumps from one stimulus to the next without pause. But when silence settles in, the mind can finally catch its breath. It can slow down and begin the gentle work of untangling. Untangling isn't about fixing or changing anything immediately. It's about creating space for what is, for the raw, unfiltered experience of being human, the fears, the joys, the regrets, the hopes that often get buried under the noise of daily life. In silence, these parts of us can emerge without judgment or interruption. They come forward not as problems to solve, but as pieces to understand, as whispers from the heart that have waited patiently for a moment of stillness. This process mirrors the way nature untangles itself after a storm. Imagine a forest after heavy rain. The wind stills, the clouds part, and the fallen branches and leaves begin to settle. Slowly, the forest returns to its natural order, not by force, but by allowing what was disturbed to find its place again. In the same way, the mind, when given silence, allows its inner chaos to settle. Emotions that felt overwhelming become clearer. Confused thoughts separate into distinct ideas. The tangled knots of worry and pain begin to loosen. Neurologically, this untangling is supported by the activation of the brain's prefrontal cortex during periods of quiet. This region is responsible for higher-order thinking, self-regulation, and emotional control. When the brain is overstimulated, this area can become overwhelmed or underactive, leading to impulsivity and emotional reactivity. But silence offers a kind of reset. It allows the prefrontal cortex to regain balance, to reassess, and to create new neural pathways that support clarity and calm. It is in these moments that insight often arises, not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual unfolding. Emotional untangling in silence also involves the limbic system, the brain's emotional center. This area stores memories and feelings, many of which can be tangled with trauma, fear, or unresolved conflict. Silence creates a safe container for these emotions to surface gently, without the pressure to act or suppress. The body can begin to release tension held in muscles and breath. Tears may come, or quiet smiles. These expressions are part of the natural process of untangling, signaling that the mind and body are working together to heal. This healing is not linear. Untangling is often messy. Some days the knots seem to tighten before they loosen. Some feelings resist being named. Some memories feel too heavy to face. But silence holds all of this without judgment or rush. It offers the space to sit with discomfort and trust that, over time, the knots will ease. The process is not about forcing clarity, but allowing it to emerge, like a thread slowly pulled free from a ball of yarn. In practical terms, untangling in silence can be supported by simple practices. Sitting quietly, focusing on the breath, noticing sensations in the body, or gently observing thoughts as they arise and pass. These practices do not attempt to control or change the experience. Instead, they cultivate a gentle awareness, a witnessing presence that holds whatever comes with kindness. Over time, this witnessing presence becomes a source of strength. It teaches us that we are not our tangled emotions or confusing thoughts. We are the space in which they appear. Untangling also reconnects us with our intuition. When the mind is cluttered, intuition is muffled. It's hard to hear that quiet voice amid the noise. But as the knots loosen, inner guidance becomes clearer. Decisions that once felt overwhelming become more manageable. The heart's wisdom begins to shine through. This clarity is not always logical or predictable, but it feels true. It feels like coming home. Another important aspect of untangling is how it changes our relationship with others. When our internal world is tangled, it's easy to project confusion outward. We may react with impatience, fear, or withdrawal. But as we begin to untangle within, our interactions can shift. We become more present, more patient, more compassionate. Silence, by allowing us to settle, creates a ripple effect, not just in our own minds, but in the way we relate to the world around us. This ripple effect reminds us that untangling is not a solitary process. Even in silence, we are connected to our own deeper selves, to the rhythms of nature, and to the community of life. The stillness we cultivate becomes a wellspring of peace that nourishes not just us, but others. And as more of us find silence, the collective noise begins to soften. The tangled threads of society, conflict, misunderstanding, fear have a chance to loosen, giving way to new patterns of connection and harmony. The power of silence to untangle is not about escaping life's challenges. It is about meeting them with a clear mind and an open heart. It is about learning to listen to ourselves and to the world in a way that is patient, gentle, and true. In this listening, the knots begin to release, the mind begins to calm, the heart begins to heal. And in that healing, we find not just relief, but transformation. There is a quiet rebellion that takes place deep within the mind when silence is embraced. A rebellion against the relentless noise, distraction, and fragmentation that so often dominate modern life. This rebellion is subtle but powerful, a gentle yet firm reclaiming of mental space that allows us to reconnect with ourselves in ways we may have forgotten were possible. The noise in our environments and within our minds can trap us in cycles of reaction, constant stimulation followed by exhaustion, making it difficult to find clarity or peace. Silence offers an escape from these cycles, not by shutting down the mind entirely, but by creating a sacred space where the unconscious can surface and be integrated. The unconscious mind is vast, mysterious, and often misunderstood. It is not simply a repository of forgotten memories or hidden desires. Rather, it is a dynamic realm where emotions, symbols, instincts, and deep truths reside. It influences our thoughts, behaviors, and perceptions in profound ways, often without our conscious awareness. In the hustle of everyday life, we rarely have the chance to engage with this part of ourselves. Noise and distraction keep us tethered to the surface, focused on what is immediate and external rather than what lies beneath. Silence, however, invites us to dive deeper. When we enter silence, the usual guardrails of conscious thought relax. The mind is no longer forced to filter, categorize, or respond. Instead, it opens a channel to the unconscious, a place where dreams, archetypes, and hidden aspects of the self can emerge. This emergence is not always neat or comfortable. Sometimes it brings images or feelings that surprise or unsettle us. But it is through this process that integration begins. The unconscious, long kept at bay, is given the opportunity to speak, to be witnessed, and to be understood. This integration is crucial for mental health and wholeness. Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, emphasized the importance of bringing the unconscious into conscious awareness, a process he called individuation. He believed that the psyche is naturally driven toward wholeness, but that this cannot happen without confronting and embracing the shadow, the parts of ourselves that we deny or repress. Silence creates the environment for this confrontation, but in a way that is patient and safe. It allows the shadow to surface not as a threat, but as a teacher. One of the ways silence facilitates this process is by reducing the constant bombardment of sensory input that keeps the mind distracted. When the mind is quiet, it becomes easier to notice patterns, both in thought and in emotion, that were previously hidden. Repeated fears, unspoken desires, recurring dreams, or persistent doubts can begin to make sense when given space. The symbols that arise in silence are often rich with meaning, drawing from universal themes that connect us to the human experience at large. This symbolic language bypasses the rational mind and speaks directly to the soul. Meditation and contemplative practices often harness silence as a tool to access these depths. In the absence of words, the mind can observe itself without judgment. This observational stance is essential. It allows unconscious content to emerge without being immediately rejected or suppressed. Over time, as more of the unconscious is integrated, a sense of inner balance and coherence grows. The tensions between different parts of the self begin to ease, and the psyche becomes more harmonious. Furthermore, silence nurtures creativity by tapping into the unconscious wellspring of ideas and inspiration. Many artists and thinkers describe moments of insight as coming from a place beyond conscious thought. A sudden flash, a dream, or a quiet knowing that seems to arise from nowhere. Silence prepares the mind for these moments by clearing away the clutter that obscures them. It is in the quiet space that the unconscious can offer its gifts most fully. Silence also helps to dissolve the illusion of separateness that often dominates conscious experience. When we listen deeply in stillness, we realize that the boundaries between self and other, inner and outer, conscious and unconscious, are more fluid than we thought. This realization is both humbling and freeing. It reminds us that we are part of a larger whole, connected to the rhythms of nature, the cycles of life, and the shared experience of being human. The unconscious, with its archetypes and universal symbols, bridges personal experience with collective meaning. This bridging is essential for spiritual growth. Many traditions describe the journey toward awakening as one of integrating the shadow, embracing the unconscious, and transcending the ego's narrow perspective. Silence is often the gateway to this journey. In silence, the ego's voice, its chatter, judgments, and defenses grows quieter, allowing the deeper self to emerge. This emergence is not about losing the ego, but about expanding beyond it to include the fullness of the psyche. The transformative power of silence lies in its ability to hold the tension between light and dark, known and unknown, conscious and unconscious. It does not push us to resolve or escape this tension, but invites us to be with it. In that presence, healing happens. Old wounds soften, hidden strengths arise. We become more whole, more authentic, more alive. To cultivate this deep connection with the unconscious through silence requires courage and commitment. It means learning to sit with discomfort, uncertainty, and mystery. It means trusting that what arises is part of the process, even when it challenges our sense of self. But the rewards are profound. A mind that is clear, a heart that is open, and a soul that is awake. In this awakened state, silence is no longer empty. It is full of wisdom, insight, and life. In the landscape of the mind, choice is often celebrated as freedom, an emblem of autonomy, self-expression, and control over our lives. Yet, paradoxically, the abundance of choices can become a trap, leading to overwhelm, anxiety, and indecision. This paradox is well captured by Barry Schwartz's concept of the paradox of choice, which reveals that having too many options often undermines our satisfaction and well-being. Silence, however, offers a counterbalance. It creates a space where the noise of endless options quiets, allowing us to reconnect with what truly matters. In that quiet, the burden of choice begins to lift. When faced with countless alternatives, whether in careers, relationships, purchases, or lifestyle decisions, the mind becomes cluttered. Every choice seems to carry weighty consequences. Fear of making the wrong decision creeps in. We worry about missing out on better options. We imagine the judgments of others. This mental noise can lead to paralysis, where the very freedom we seek becomes an obstacle to action. In this landscape of confusion, silence becomes a sanctuary, a place to step back from the swirling possibilities and reconnect with clarity. Silence allows us to slow down. In the absence of external input, advertisements, social media, conversations filled with opinions, we can hear our own thoughts more clearly. This hearing is not just intellectual, but visceral. The mind and body begin to align around what feels right, rather than what appears appealing or socially approved. This alignment is essential. It is where values, intuition, and genuine desire intersect, guiding us toward choices that resonate deeply rather than superficially. Moreover, silence helps reduce the cognitive load imposed by choice overload. Our brains have a limited capacity to process information at once. When overwhelmed, decision-making quality declines. We become more prone to regret, dissatisfaction, and impulsivity. By embracing silence, we give our cognitive systems a chance to rest. The mental chatter subsides. Neural networks associated with executive function can regroup and regain efficiency. This restoration supports more thoughtful, confident decision-making. Silence also reconnects us with the deeper meaning behind our choices. In a culture focused on external achievement and material gain, it's easy to lose sight of why we want what we want. Are we choosing a job because it aligns with our passion or because it pays well? Are we pursuing a relationship out of genuine connection or social expectation? In silence, we can explore these questions without distraction. The mind can wander inward, uncovering layers of motivation, fear, and hope. This introspection often reveals hidden truths, enabling choices that are not only practical but authentic. The power of silence in decision-making is evident in practices like meditation and contemplative prayer, where quiet reflection allows insights to surface. These traditions emphasize the importance of pausing before action, creating space for the heart and mind to harmonize. In the stillness, we become less reactive to external pressures and more responsive to our inner wisdom. This responsiveness nurtures patience and reduces impulsivity, helping us avoid choices made from fear or haste. Importantly, silence fosters acceptance of uncertainty. In the face of many options, we often crave certainty, a guarantee that our choice will be the best. But life is inherently uncertain. Silence teaches us to sit with this uncertainty without anxiety. It helps us cultivate trust in ourselves, in the process, and in the unfolding of life. This trust does not eliminate risk, but softens the fear around it. It reminds us that no choice is final, and that each path holds opportunities for growth. This acceptance of uncertainty also encourages a shift from perfectionism to progress. Silence reveals that waiting for the perfect choice can become a form of avoidance, a way to defer action indefinitely. By creating space to listen deeply, we can discern when it's time to decide and move forward, even without all the answers. In this way, silence supports courage and resilience. Furthermore, silence nurtures creativity in decision-making. When the mind is quiet, it can access a wider range of possibilities, including unconventional or intuitive options that might be dismissed in a noisy, pressured environment. This creative space allows us to imagine outcomes and pathways that align more fully with our unique selves and circumstances. It invites innovation, not only in work or art, but in the everyday choices that shape our lives. The influence of silence extends beyond individual decisions. When practiced collectively, such as in mindful meetings or contemplative dialogues, silence can transform how groups make choices. It fosters deeper listening, reduces groupthink, and opens space for diverse perspectives to be heard. In these shared silences, the collective intelligence often surpasses what any individual could achieve alone. In essence, silence acts as a clarifying lens, cutting through the fog of excess and distraction. It returns us to simplicity, not by reducing options arbitrarily, but by reconnecting us to what matters most. In that clarity, choice becomes less about juggling possibilities and more about aligning with purpose. It shifts from being a source of stress to a pathway toward freedom. And as we integrate silence into our decision-making processes, we begin to embody a new rhythm, one that balances action with reflection, impulse with patience, complexity with simplicity. This rhythm supports not only better choices, but a more peaceful, grounded way of living. It reminds us that in the quiet, we find not emptiness, but fullness, not confusion, but clarity, not paralysis, but possibility. In the labyrinth of the mind, there are traps that quietly ensnare us, often without our immediate awareness. One of the most insidious of these is the psychological trap of avoidance, when we turn away from our inner realities instead of facing them directly. Silence, in this context, serves as both a mirror and a challenge. It reveals the parts of ourselves we have been evading, yet it also offers the pathway through which we can confront and heal these hidden aspects. Carl Jung, the pioneer of analytical psychology, understood this dynamic deeply. He saw avoidance not as failure, but as a natural resistance to discomfort, and silence as the antidote that gently dissolves this resistance. The modern mind is conditioned for constant activity. We are taught to be productive, to stay busy, to avoid boredom at all costs. In this whirlwind, silence becomes an enemy, something to be feared or escaped. It brings forth the voices and feelings we usually try to suppress: anxiety, loneliness, regret, shame. These emotions do not disappear simply because we distract ourselves. They linger, shaping our behavior from the shadows, influencing our decisions and relationships in ways we do not fully understand. This is the trap. By avoiding silence, we avoid the opportunity to engage with these unresolved parts of ourselves. But when silence is embraced, the mind begins to shift. It moves from reactive chaos to reflective stillness. The initial discomfort is often intense. The mind may resist, flooding with thoughts or urges to escape. Yet this resistance is a sign that something important is near, a part of the psyche waiting to be acknowledged. Jung called this the shadow, the unconscious aspects of the personality that the conscious mind has rejected or denied. The shadow holds both our fears and our potentials, and it is through meeting it in silence that we begin to integrate it into wholeness. Integration is not a quick or easy process. It requires patience, courage, and compassion. Silence provides the safe container for this process, allowing us to hold our inner turmoil without being overwhelmed. In the absence of distraction, we learn to observe our fears and impulses with curiosity rather than judgment. We begin to recognize patterns, how avoidance perpetuates pain, how resistance fuels anxiety, how denial blocks growth. This awareness is the first step toward freedom. Neurologically, silence supports this integration by calming the amygdala, the brain's fear center, allowing the prefrontal cortex to regain control. When the amygdala is hyperactive, the mind is stuck in survival mode, perceiving threats even when none exist. Silence helps deactivate this mode, giving the higher brain function space to process emotions rationally and compassionately. This neural reset facilitates emotional regulation and resilience, enabling us to face what we have long avoided. Silence also allows us to hear the subtle language of the body. Often, psychological avoidance is stored physically, in tension, pain, or fatigue. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget. When we sit quietly and listen inward, We become attuned to these somatic signals. Breath becomes shallow or deepens. Muscles clench or relax. Heart rate fluctuates. These sensations provide clues to our inner state, inviting us to respond with care rather than denial. This embodied awareness is essential for healing, bridging mind and body in a unified process of becoming whole. Moreover, the psychological trap of avoidance is often maintained by stories we tell ourselves, narratives that justify our fears and keep us stuck. Silence interrupts these narratives. It creates a gap between stimulus and response, thought and action. In this gap, choice becomes possible. Instead of automatically fleeing discomfort, we can pause, reflect, and choose to stay present. This pause is the birthplace of transformation. Embracing silence also cultivates self-compassion. When we stop running, we may confront harsh self-judgments that have been driving avoidance. Silence allows these judgments to surface, but in a space where they can be softened. We begin to see ourselves not as failures or flaws, but as complex beings navigating pain and growth. This compassion is a healing balm, reducing the internal conflict that fuels avoidance and opening the heart to change. The path out of avoidance through silence is deeply personal. Some find it in meditation, others in solitary walks, journaling, or simply sitting quietly each day. The common thread is the willingness to be with oneself fully, without escape or distraction. This willingness is a form of courage, a commitment to truth over comfort, presence over avoidance. Over time, this practice reshapes the mind. The trap loses its power as we learn to hold discomfort without fleeing. Silence becomes a refuge, not a threat. We discover that within stillness, we are not alone, but accompanied by our own deeper wisdom and resilience. The psychological trap of avoidance is transformed from a prison into a passageway, a gateway through which we step into greater freedom, authenticity, and peace. And as we deepen our relationship with silence, we find that the mind's restless chatter quiets not because we force it, but because it finds something richer to attend to. The inner landscape unfolds, revealing layers of meaning, connection, and potential that were hidden beneath avoidance. This unfolding is the essence of healing, a slow, steady unveiling of the self in its fullest, most luminous form. Time is one of the most elusive experiences of human life. It flows, stretches, contracts, and often feels beyond our control. Yet, the way we perceive time is deeply tied to the rhythms of our mind and body. In moments of silence, especially prolonged or intentional silence, our experience of time can shift dramatically. Philosopher Henri Bergson described time not as a fixed measurement, but as duration, a flowing, qualitative experience that is felt rather than calculated. Silence offers a unique doorway into this felt sense of time, allowing us to step outside the hurried ticking of clocks and calendars and enter a more expansive, present-focused awareness. When we live immersed in noise and distraction, time often feels compressed. Days blur into each other. Moments rush past without being fully noticed. The brain is constantly processing stimuli, switching tasks, anticipating the next event. This rapid-fire mode keeps us oriented toward the future or the past rather than the present. But silence interrupts this pattern. In stillness, the brain can slow its rhythms, and with it, our sense of time expands. Seconds can feel like minutes. Minutes can feel like an eternity. This dilation is not about boredom or waiting. It is about fullness. The present moment stretches, revealing depth and texture that often go unnoticed. Neurologically, this shift is connected to changes in brainwave activity. As the brain moves from fast beta waves associated with active thinking to slower alpha and theta waves during relaxation and meditation, our perception of time alters. These slower waves correlate with a more immersive state of consciousness, where awareness is heightened but not rushed. The brain seems to create a kind of internal spaciousness, a pause that lets moments unfold fully rather than be skimmed over. This is why many people describe silent retreats or deep meditative states as experiences where time loses its usual grip and feels fluid. Philosophically, Bergson argued that clock time, measured, linear, divisible, is a practical abstraction. It allows societies to coordinate, plan, and function, but it does not capture lived experience. Our true experience of time is qualitative. It changes with our emotional states, our focus, and our consciousness. Silence restores access to this qualitative time, where moments are not just units to be counted, but experiences to be inhabited. In silence, we no longer chase time. We enter its flow. This transformation of time perception has practical implications for well-being. When time feels compressed, stress and anxiety often increase. We feel pressured, rushed, and overwhelmed. But when time expands in silence, it creates a buffer against these pressures. The mind and body relax into the moment, releasing tension. There is no hurry, no urgency. Instead, there is presence. This presence supports not only relaxation, but insight, creativity, and healing. Silence also reveals the cyclical nature of time more clearly. Natural rhythms, breath, heartbeat, sleep cycles, the changing of seasons become more palpable. We begin to notice the ebb and flow within ourselves and around us. This awareness reconnects us to the larger cycles of life, reminding us that time is not a straight arrow, but a spiral, a wave, a dance. In this dance, each moment contains all moments. Past, present, and future interweave in a continuous fabric of experience. The perception of time in silence challenges our habitual orientation toward productivity and efficiency. Modern life values doing and achieving within set timeframes, often neglecting the value of simply being. Silence invites us to reconsider this relationship. It teaches us that some of the most important experiences, connection, insight, peace, cannot be rushed or scheduled. They arise in moments that require openness rather than control. By allowing time to slow, silence restores our capacity to savor these experiences. Moreover, the expanded sense of time nurtured by silence can deepen our sense of gratitude and wonder. When moments are not fleeting, we have space to appreciate the subtle beauty in simple things: a breath, a sound, a sensation. This appreciation grounds us in the present and fosters a sense of awe that enriches life. It counters the numbness that comes from overstimulation and rush. The way silence alters time perception also enhances memory and learning. When we experience time as expansive, events and insights imprint more deeply. the brain can process information more thoroughly, integrating it into our narrative rather than letting it pass as background noise. This deep processing supports personal growth and transformation. In relationships, a shared silence can create a similar temporal shift. When two or more people sit together in quiet presence, the usual pressures of conversation and social performance ease. Time stretches and connection deepens. The silence becomes a shared space where presence itself speaks volumes, fostering intimacy and understanding beyond words. Ultimately, the experience of time in silence is a return to a more natural rhythm, a rhythm that honors the cyclical, fluid, and dynamic nature of life itself. It reminds us that time is not an enemy to be conquered or a resource to be maximized, but a river to be navigated with awareness and grace. In this navigation, silence is both guide and companion, opening the way toward a fuller, richer experience of being alive. As we continue to explore silence, we find that our relationship with time transforms not just in quiet moments, but throughout our lives. The ability to slow down, to inhabit moments fully, and to embrace the unfolding flow of existence becomes a source of resilience and joy. It invites us to live not in the tyranny of the clock, but in the freedom of duration, the living pulse of time itself. As we gently come to the close of this journey through silence and its profound effects on the brain, mind, and soul, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on what we've uncovered together. Silence is far more than the mere absence of sound. It is a dynamic presence that holds space for healing, creativity, insight, and transformation. In our noisy, fast-paced world, it can feel like an elusive luxury, a rare pause amid the chaos. Yet silence is not something distant or unattainable. It is always within reach, waiting quietly in the spaces between our breaths, in the pauses between thoughts, in the moments when we choose to simply be. By embracing silence, we invite our minds to slow down, to rest, and to regenerate. We create a sanctuary where the brain can repair itself, where intuition can whisper truths, and where the complexities of emotion can unfold and find their resolution. Silence teaches us patience with ourselves and others, offering a refuge from the relentless demands of modern life. It reconnects us with the rhythms of nature, the flow of time, and the depths of our own consciousness. As you carry this understanding forward, remember that silence is a gift you can return to again and again. It requires no special equipment, no travel to distant places, no extraordinary effort. It asks only for your presence and your willingness to listen. Whether it's a few moments of quiet breath in the morning, a mindful walk without distractions, or simply sitting peacefully with yourself as the world hums around you, each encounter with silence strengthens your ability to live with greater clarity, calm, and connection. Wherever you are in the world tonight, whatever challenges or joys you carry with you, may you find a moment of stillness to return to your center. Let silence be your guide, your healer, your companion. In its gentle embrace, may you rediscover the fullness of your being, the creativity, wisdom, and peace that have always been there beneath the noise. Thank you for joining me on this exploration. I invite you to carry the quiet with you, share it with others, and return to it whenever you need. Because in silence, we do not find emptiness, we find everything. Until next time, may your mind be calm, your heart be open, and your soul be nourished by the beautiful power of silence.